The bottle is always small, narrow, elegant, something that could disappear inside a silk glove or the pocket of a gentleman's waistcoat. Its contents, however, betray none of that refinement. A few grains, no more than the sugar at the bottom of a teacup, carry the scent of bitter almonds, the faintest whisper of death dressed in perfume. In parlors lit by gaslight, where propriety softened every sin, cyanide moved quietly from hand to hand, hidden beneath lace cuffs and polite conversation. Apothecaries sold it with a smile, chemists measured it with steady fingers, and every household seemed to possess a vial for pests, though pests were rarely the intended target. A widow's sudden collapse at supper, a banker going rigid over his brandy glass, a servant found cold at dawn. So many tragedies disguised themselves as illness, while the real culprit evaporated before any doctor could arrive. Cyanide killed swiftly, elegantly, leaving behind nothing but a pale face, a still cup, and a room that smelled faintly of almonds and unanswered questions. In Victorian London, murder did not need a weapon. Sometimes it came wrapped in ribbon, stirred into cocoa, or slipped beneath the sweetness of cordial. And in a society obsessed with appearances, it was the perfect crime, silent, scent-soft, and gone before anyone could name it. If you want more dark, gaslit secrets of Victorian London, make sure to like, subscribe, and tell me where you're watching from. Your support keeps these shadows burning. It always began with something beautiful, a bottle no larger than a lady's perfume vial, its glass tinted a gentle sapphire or pale rose, as if meant to contain scent rather than death. The chemists of Victorian London understood the art of presentation well. Their shelves gleamed with rows of dainty containers wrapped in velvet ribbon or wax paper frills, each promising relief for coughs, nerves, sleeplessness, and, for those who understood its darker potential, opportunity. Cyanide did not announce itself with menace. It hid behind grace, behind elegance, behind the Victorian obsession with refinement, entering homes as quietly as a new fashion. When a woman stepped into a chemist's shop on a dim winter afternoon, the door chime tinkled with polite innocence. The odors of camphor and lavender floated in the air, masking the more acrid notes that drifted from the back room. Behind the frosted glass counter, a gentleman in a neatly brushed coat would bow slightly and inquire in soft tones, "What may I prepare for you today, madam?" And she gloved, composed, her heart beating far too loudly in her ears, would slide a small written request across the countertop. "Prussic acid," the note might read, or "potassium cyanide," or something gentler still, "compound for silver cleaning," though both she and the chemist knew no such thing truly required this ingredient. Behind him, glass jars captured the light like jewels. The chemist would turn, lift one tenderly, as if handling a relic, and measure out a few grains of a powder finer than sugar. Each gesture was ritualistic, almost devotional. Victorian society prized order, propriety, discretion, and nowhere were these virtues more essential than in death, dealt quietly. The chemist would not ask questions. He might merely nod, fold the powder into parchment, and slide it back across the counter with the same grace he'd offer a packet of lavender salts. The ribbon around it was a courtesy, though its softness would later look grotesque in the flicker of lamplight beside a corpse. In parlors across London, the real transformation occurred. The moment when the innocent-looking bottle left the chemist's hand and entered the world of domestic ritual. Set beside a tea tray, tucked into a sewing basket, slipped beneath the folds of a mourning shawl, it waited. Cyanide required no force, no sound, no weapon raised in anger. A pinch into a sugar bowl, a few drops into cordial, a dusting across a wine glass rim, these were the methods of those who wished to kill without disturbing the lace on the tablecloth. The poison itself worked with an elegant swiftness. One breath, one swallow, one small, bitter kiss upon the tongue, then the heart faltered, the limbs stiffened, and death swept in like a curtain being drawn. The victim's face blanched into porcelain calm, as though sleep had claimed them mid-thought. And because cyanide vanished almost instantly into the body's secret chambers, doctors arrived too late to understand what they saw. A faint almond scent, barely perceptible, hovered in the room, a whisper of guilt easily missed amid the candle smoke and camphor-soaked cloths. Thus, wrapped in silk and sold with courtesy, the deadliest poison of the Victorian era entered the bloodstream of the city. It passed from hand to hand beneath gaslight, its presence hidden within the soft rustle of skirts and the careful click of teacups. No scream accompanied its violence, no blood betrayed its purpose. Only a delicate bottle, resting on a mantelpiece or tucked into a pocket, holding a beauty too perfect to suspect and a death too swift to prove. This was London's quietest weapon, and this was the beginning of its long, scented reign. The chemist's shop sat on a narrow corner of Bloomsbury, its windows glowing softly beneath the pale haze of gas lamps. From the street, it looked perfectly respectable, trustworthy. Even medicine bottles stood in tidy rows behind the glass like soldiers in translucent uniforms, their corks sealed neatly, their labels penned with careful script. But the frosted pane that masked the back room told another story. Behind that hazy veil, the true heart of Victorian pharmacology beat, quiet, precise, and dangerously unregulated. Mr. Hollingford, the chemist, prided himself on discretion. His coat was always buttoned, his spectacles polished, his tone gentle enough to calm the most anxious of widows. He had learned long ago that Victorian Londoners preferred their medicines and their secrets handled with equal delicacy. When customers entered, shaking out their umbrellas or brushing soot from their sleeves, Hollingford greeted them with the soft warmth of a man who asked no unnecessary questions. The bell above the door chimed, and he would look up with a reassuring half-smile, as if to say, "Whatever brings you here, it will be managed quietly." The back room, however, was another matter entirely. There, beneath the ghostly glow of a single lamp, powders and tinctures were measured with relentless accuracy. Hollingford kept a scale so sensitive it could detect the difference between a sigh and a breath. It was here that he handled cyanide. Potassium cyanide, white, crystalline, deceptively pure. Prussic acid liquid death with a faint almond sweetness. He stored them in glass vials sealed with wax and marked only with discreet symbols, a language known better to killers than to doctors. The demand had increased over the years, and Hollingford noticed it. Well-dressed ladies purchasing small amounts for vermin, nervous young men insisting they required cyanide for photographic development, servants who avoided his gaze as they accepted parcels wrapped more carefully than jewelry. Each transaction carved a subtle line into the chemist's conscience, though not enough to stop his hand. In Victorian London, necessity and curiosity sold as well as desperation, and Hollingford, like so many of his profession, believed that providing the substance absolved him from whatever others chose to do with it. One particularly cold evening, a woman entered the shop wearing a dark green cloak edged with mourning crepe. Her face was pale, her voice steady, and her request handwritten in looping script, potassium cyanide, 1 drachm. Hollingford's hand paused only briefly before he nodded. He had seen her before twice in the last month, each time after the death of a relative. Her purchases were always small, always polite, and always timed to tragedy, yet nothing in her manner betrayed guilt. She thanked him with quiet grace, tucked the ribbon-wrapped packet into her reticule, and stepped back into the swirling fog. Hollingford never knew that he had likely handed her 3 deaths. But even he could not ignore the pattern creeping across London. Sudden collapses at dinner tables, unexplained fainting spells at soirée gatherings, brides who failed to wake on their wedding morning. The inquests grew more frequent, the whispers darker. Still, the chemists' shops hummed with their usual business, serving the city's needs as faithfully as ever. Hollingford continued to measure, pour, fold, and seal his parcels of powder with the same immaculate precision. Yet every night, as he extinguished his lamp and locked the frosted door behind him, he noticed the faint scent of almonds lingering on his coat, a scent that did not belong to any perfume, a scent that clung to him as though the ghosts of his clients had followed him home. And though he would never admit it aloud, Hollingford had begun to wonder whether he was London's most discreet healer or its most unwitting accomplice. It was a smell so faint that most never noticed it, an aroma that drifted like a forgotten memory through the corners of a deathbed. The scent of bitter almonds became, in time, one of the most whispered terrors of Victorian London. Sweetness mingled with sorrow, delicate yet unmistakably wrong. It hovered above pillows, seeped into lace handkerchiefs, and clung to the air long after the body had grown still. To those who recognized it, the scent was a confession, soft, almost polite, yet damning. Doctors learned to dread it most of all. They arrived in dimly lit bedrooms where family members stood wringing their hands, insisting the collapse had been sudden, inexplicable. The patient, once lively, flushed, and full of breath, now lay pale as pressed ivory beneath embroidered quilts. Candles flickered nearby, their flames trembling in the hush that followed tragedy. But behind the wax and the camphor fumes, behind the lavender water dabbed onto cold wrists in futile hope, there it was, a faint trace of almonds, drifting like a secret exhalation. Some physicians ignored it, others, more experienced or more cynical, recognized it instantly. But even these men hesitated. Cyanide was a dangerous accusation. To smell almonds was to smell murder, quiet, elegant murder with a velvet-gloved hand. And so they coughed gently into their sleeves, adjusted their stethoscopes, and wrote "heart failure" or "apoplexy" in careful ink. Victorian medicine preferred not to point fingers. Death, after all, already caused enough social inconvenience. Servants, however, whispered the scent among themselves with greater boldness. In kitchens and sculleries, while polishing silver or beating dust from carpets, they shared rumours. The master's sudden passing after supper, the mistress fainting after her cordial, the governess who died without a sound in her attic chamber. Always the same, the almond scent that drifted from lips gone bluer than they should have, from breath that no longer stirred the air. For some, it became an omen, a sign that a household hid secrets, a clue that someone beneath that roof, perhaps someone trusted, had a reason to kill. Servants knew the shape of their employers' lives. They knew the arguments behind closed doors, the unpaid debts, the jealous glances across drawing rooms, and they knew when a lady's trembling hand lingered too thoughtfully over a teacup that wasn't hers. But the scent played tricks as well. On colder nights, when fog thickened against the windows, even harmless medicines carried faint notes mistaken for almonds. Candles infused with cherry oil muddied the truth. Kitchens filled with crushed apricot kernels confused the nervous mind. And so London became a city unsure of its own senses. Was that almond sweetness real, or merely a symptom of fear? The boundary blurred, and suspicion spread like a subtle perfume. Still, the murders continued. Cyanide worked with merciless speed, stealing breath and darkening veins within minutes. It left no struggle, no wound, no sign of violence. Only that soft, sweet smell that lingered in the air long after the dying gasp faded. Detectives grew accustomed to entering rooms where the air felt almost perfumed, as though the victim had prepared for a final performance. The scent would graze their senses, soft but sinister, a ghostly fingerprint. And in parlors where wealthy families gathered to mourn, guests would approach the coffin, remarking politely on how peaceful the departed looked. Yet some would pause, tilt their heads, frown faintly. For a moment they would think they detected it, the faintest whisper of bitter almonds rising from polished mahogany. Most dismissed it, a trick of the imagination, a scent carried from the florist's bouquet, a memory conjured by fear. But a few those who had smelled it before turned away quickly, for they knew, and their silence wrapped the truth as tightly as any funeral shroud. London, it seemed, was becoming a city where even sweetness could kill. She entered the shop the way many respectable Victorian women entered forbidden places, swiftly, silently, wrapped in composure, as carefully as in her winter shawl. The bell above the chemist's door tinkled a fragile warning, but her expression did not flicker. Her face, pale beneath a modest hat, was arranged in perfect gentility. If anything betrayed her purpose, it was the gloved hand clutched too tightly around a small velvet pouch. But even that, in the dim manners of the age, could be mistaken for grief. Widows were common enough in London. The chemist recognized her immediately, not by name, for names were rarely exchanged in such transactions, but by the air she carried. Many who came seeking cyanide wore desperation like a scent. Others trembled with guilt. She, however, moved with the quiet assurance of someone who had already made her decision. The sort of decision Victorian society preferred not to confront. A death arranged with grace, a tragedy brewed in porcelain cups rather than drawn swords. "Good afternoon, madam," the chemist murmured, bowing with respectful caution. "How may I be of service?" She produced a folded slip of paper, not handwritten too risky, but cut neatly from an apothecary manual. Potassium cyanide, a simple request on an innocent scrap. Her voice, when she spoke, was barely above a whisper. "For vermin?" The chemist nodded, neither believing nor doubting her. Such was the etiquette of the era. He disappeared into the back room, the frosted panes swallowing his silhouette. The lady stood alone, her hands still clasped before her, her breath shallow. The faint smell of camphor and rosewater mingled in the air, and for a moment she closed her eyes, whether in resolve or in dread, even she could not say. Her story was not unique. She had married well, as society termed it, to a gentleman older by 2 decades and immeasurably wealthier. He had been courteous in public, commanding in private, and cruel in the privacy of his temper. The bruises he left never reached her face, for appearances were important in their household. Her suffering lived beneath bodices and linen. When visitors came, he poured tea, laughed heartily, and rested a gentle hand on her shoulder, as though affection came easily to him. It never had. Yet divorce was unthinkable. A scandal would ruin her, a separation would leave her penniless. Society demanded patience, silence, and devotion from wives, even when devotion meant swallowing fear in nightly doses. And so she rode through seasons of dread until one winter evening, after a particularly violent outburst, she found herself staring at her reflection in the looking-glass and realizing she no longer recognized the woman within it. She deserved to breathe freely, to sleep without trembling, to reclaim the life she had lost. And Victorian London, cold, polite, and quietly pragmatic, offered one solution more accessible than any legal recourse: cyanide. The chemist returned with a small paper packet folded like a secret letter. He tied it with a thin white ribbon, as if presenting a gift rather than a death sentence. She accepted it calmly, placed it in her velvet pouch, and left the shop with the same soft-footed grace with which she had entered. Outside, the fog thickened along the street, swallowing her silhouette. Her carriage awaited, its lanterns glowing faintly in the dusk. As she stepped inside, she felt the packet shift beneath her glove, a whisper of powder, a promise sealed. By the time the chemist extinguished his lamps that night, the lady had already prepared her plan. Tomorrow evening, there would be brandy by the fire, poured by a devoted wife for her weary husband. The room would smell of oak paneling and tobacco, and somewhere beneath those scents, hidden like a sigh, would drift the faintest sweetness of almonds. No one would question her grief. No one ever did. Dr. Alistair Penworth was a man accustomed to lateness, not in his own conduct, for he prided himself on punctuality, but in the summonses that reached him through fog-thickened streets long after the crisis had already passed. Victorian London had a habit of calling upon its physicians only when the struggle was nearly finished, when breath had thinned to a thread, or when it had already snapped entirely. By the time Penworth arrived at many bedside vigils, the room held more silence than life. He never blamed the families. Death moved quickly in crowded, soot-choked neighborhoods. Illness spread like whispered rumor. But lately, Penworth had begun to recognize something far stranger, far more unsettling than the usual fevers and consumptions that gnawed at the city's poor. These new deaths came suddenly, without warning, without lingering illness. A man in fine health at supper would be cold by midnight. A young bride laughing at a ball could collapse before removing her gloves. And when Penworth bent beside the still forms, lifting their lids or listening futilely for heartbeats, he sensed it, the faint almond sweetness. He tried, at first, to dismiss it as trickery of the mind, a scent carried from some nearby confectioner's shop, or perhaps a remnant of the perfumes Londoners dabbed so liberally upon themselves. But the more he encountered the dead in parlors softened by candlelight and perfumed with grief, the more that subtle aroma haunted him. It clung to lips that had gone blue too swiftly. It drifted from the lace collars of gentlemen who had no business dying so quietly. It lingered in the folds of bedsheets where the recently departed lay unnaturally composed. One winter evening, Penworth received an urgent knock on his door. A footman, breathless and pale beneath the gas lamps, begged him to come at once. "My master has taken ill, very ill," the young man stammered. Penworth gathered his bag and followed him through the freezing streets to a handsome townhouse whose windows glowed with anxious candlelight. Inside, the family waited in despair. The master of the house, a well-regarded solicitor, lay motionless on a chaise longue, his face waxen, his hands curled unnaturally, as if caught mid-grasp. Penworth knelt at once, unbuttoning the man's waistcoat and checking his pulse. There was none, not even a faint flutter. The room smelled faintly of brandy, of polished wood, and yes, of almonds. "What happened?" Penworth whispered. His wife, elegant even in distress, clasped a handkerchief to her trembling mouth. "He coughed once, just once, and then he fell back. I thought it was a faint spell. I did not—" Her voice splintered into sobs. Penworth studied the empty brandy glass on the table, the spoon resting beside it, the slight discoloration on the man's lips. He knew what this meant. Cyanide. He had read of its lethality in medical journals. He had seen its aftermath in small birds and strays poisoned by cruel boys in alleyways. But in the drawing-room of a solicitor? In the lamplit dignity of a respectable home? It was spreading. He wanted to speak the truth, to say the word that hovered like a cold draught between the curtains. Poison. But Victorian society loathed scandal more than it feared death. To name cyanide would be to accuse someone present, someone grieving. And so, as he had done before, Penworth hesitated. "Heart failure," he murmured softly, though his stomach churned at the lie. Sudden, not uncommon in these colder months. The widow collapsed into her chair with a strangled cry of relief and sorrow combined. No questioning, no scandal, no investigation. But as Penworth packed his bag, he caught the footman staring at him wide-eyed, afraid, as though he too had scented the almonds and understood all that it implied. When Penworth stepped back into the night, fog wrapped around him like a shroud. His boots echoed down the cobblestones, each step heavier than the last. He had seen enough to know that cyanide was no longer the poison of the desperate few. It had slipped, sweet and silent, into the bloodstream of the city. And London, for all its elegance and order, had not yet learned to recognize the scent of its own decay. The coroner's office on Chancery Lane was a place where sorrow was translated into ink. Dimly lit, always a little too cold, it smelled of sealing wax, damp wool, and the faint metallic tang of the instruments kept in locked drawers. It was here that Mr. Percival Hartright, coroner for nearly 2 decades, performed the quiet work of transforming tragedy into paperwork, inquiries into reports, and lives into causes of death. His pen, once steady and confident, had begun to tremble in recent years, though never because of age. It trembled because London was changing. Bodies were arriving too quickly, too many, too sudden, too similar. They were brought in from drawing rooms, from brothels, from boarding houses and dining tables. They all bore the same terrifying signature pallor, too immediate, eyes too vacant, and that scent, that faint, elusive sweetness like almonds crushed beneath a mortar. But Hartright also knew a dreadful truth. There was no respectable way to write cyanide on a death register without unleashing consequences far beyond his wooden desk. One morning in early March, 2 constables carried the body of a young governess into his examination room. She had collapsed after supper, they said, her employer's children screaming as she fell from her chair. Hartright pulled back the linen sheet and studied her face. She looked peaceful, too peaceful for someone who had died in agony, as cyanide so often inflicted. Her lips bore the faintest blush of blue. A ring of moisture still clung to the corners of her mouth, as though she had sipped something moments before her collapse. Hartright leaned in. The almond note, soft, cold, unmistakable, rose from her skin. It brushed against his senses like a whispered accusation. He swallowed. Next came the inquest. The employer, a gentleman of some standing, stood stiff and indignant before the coroner's table. "She must have had a weak heart," he insisted. "Poor constitution. She always did look fragile." His wife dabbed theatrically at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. Their children remained at home, mercifully spared the spectacle. The constables waited. The clerk poised his quill. The coroner bowed his head over his ledger. Cause of death: sudden failure of the heart due to natural causes. He wrote it slowly, the words weighted by something more oppressive than sorrow. The truth hovered behind him, close enough to touch. Cyanide had done its work. But Victorian England did not welcome truth when it threatened scandal. Poison implied intent. Intent implied someone sitting in that very room had reason to kill. After the inquest, Hartright returned to his examination room. He washed his hands until the water turned cold. The scent still clung to him. More bodies arrived in the days that followed: a banker, a maid, a solicitor's wife, all claimed by death too quickly to question, all carrying that faint perfume of almonds. Hartright found himself waking in the night, hearing the scrape of his pen on paper in his dreams, rewriting the same lie again and again. One evening, after recording his 5th suspicious death in a week, he paused before closing the ledger. A blot of ink pooled beneath his trembling fingers. The flame of his lamp flickered uncertainly, as though the room itself were holding its breath. "What have we become?" he whispered to the empty air. London, polite and polished, had become a city skilled in concealment. Poison did not roar, it whispered. It did not stain, it dissolved. Cyanide left no mark except on men like him, men forced to bury truth beneath official ink. And every time he wrote the words "natural causes," he felt he was tightening the shroud around the city's conscience. As he extinguished the lamp for the night, Hartright caught a final waft of bitter almond drifting from his sleeves. He wondered, for the first time, if one day the scent would cling to him, not as witness, but as victim. In Victorian London, danger rarely looked like danger. It came disguised in decanters etched with floral patterns, in bottles labelled tonic or cordial, in powders tucked discreetly behind glass-fronted cabinets. A household might keep laudanum for sleep, chloroform for nerves, arsenic for rats, and cyanide, the most silent of killers, for reasons no one dared examine too closely. The city had grown accustomed to living among poisons the way it lived among fog, quietly, cautiously, pretending neither existed as long as no one named them. Inside a respectable townhouse on Fitzrovia's quieter streets, Mrs. Eleanor Whitley kept a tidy apothecary shelf in her kitchen pantry. To visitors, it seemed a mark of good housewifery. Jars neatly labelled in looping script, medicines arranged from strongest to mildest, a small pestle and mortar resting on a polished wooden tray. But anyone who looked closely enough, though few ever did, would have noticed a curious pattern. Some jars emptied faster than others, some were never touched at all, and one tiny blue vial, no larger than a thumb, was kept at the far back of the shelf, hidden behind a jar of barley and a tin of dried lavender. Potassium cyanide. Mrs. Whitley claimed it was for silver cleaning. This explanation satisfied guests, servants, and even her husband, who rarely noticed anything beyond the end of his cigar. The truth, however, was a shade darker. The vial had been purchased 3 years earlier, just in case, a phrase women of the era used when speaking of emergencies they hoped never to face. For some, just in case meant illness, for others, heartbreak. For a few, it meant survival of a different sort. Though she had never used it, Mrs. Whitley checked the vial often. Sometimes in the early morning, when her house was steeped in quiet and her breath fogged in the cold, she would uncap the vial and catch the faintest aroma, sweet, almond-like, deceptively gentle. She would close it quickly, shaken by its softness. It seemed impossible that something so delicate could end a life before a scream could even form. But Victorian science made deadly promises in demure packaging. A single grain dissolved in wine, a few drops stirred into a weak cordial. The poison acted swiftly, silently, leaving behind no struggle, only a body fallen slack against a chair, or a pale face resting upon a pillow, as though sleep had simply deepened into eternity. Mrs. Whitley knew of such tragedies. Her neighbour, Mrs. Avery, had lost a sister to sudden apoplexy at the age of 25. Another woman on the street had become a widow after her husband collapsed during supper, and though no physician said it aloud, everyone whispered about the scent, how the rooms where these deaths occurred held an aroma like almonds crushed in sugar. Too faint to name, too damning to discuss. One evening, Mrs. Whitley found her husband in the pantry, thumbing through jars with carelessness that made her heart hammer. His fingers brushed the lavender tin, then the barley jar, then lingered dangerously near the little blue vial. She froze in the doorway, watching his hand hover, waiting, praying that curiosity would curve elsewhere. It did. He grunted, retrieved a jar of peppermint lozenges, and shut the cabinet without a second glance. But the moment hung in her mind long after he left the room. How easily a hand could stray, how swiftly a life could pivot upon the contents of a misjudged bottle. That night she moved the cyanide again, slipping it into a locked wooden box beneath her sewing table. She told herself it was safer there, out of reach, out of sight, not forgotten but contained. Yet as she turned the key, she realized something unsettling. The vial no longer frightened her. It comforted her. Its very existence felt like a small shard of control in a world where women were expected to bear their hardships without protest. In a city filled with whispered miseries and well-dressed suffering, cyanide offered quietly, seductively, a different sort of promise. Not chaos or revenge, but a choice. A final answer sealed in blue glass. London households kept many secrets. Some wore lace, some wore bruises, and some waited, patient and powerful, behind cupboard doors. The most dangerous objects were never the largest. They were the smallest, the easiest to hide, and the easiest to pour. In Victorian bedrooms, mirrors were more than ornaments. They were silent witnesses reflecting candlelight, catching the shimmer of silk nightgowns, and observing the most private moments of life and death with cold, silvered clarity. When illness visited a household, it was customary to cover these mirrors with shawls or drapes, lest the departing soul glimpse its fading form and cling too tightly to earth. But in cases of Cyanide's swift cruelty, there was rarely time for such rituals. Death came too suddenly, too silently, and the mirrors, uncovered and unblinking, captured everything. On a quiet street in South Kensington, the household of Mr. and Mrs. Redmayne kept one such mirror, a tall, gilt-edged heirloom standing beside the marital bed. It had watched decades of their union joys, sorrows, whispered arguments, reconciliations. But on the evening of Mr. Redmayne's death, it reflected something new, the shock of a life extinguished in an instant. He had not been ill. He had not complained of any discomfort. Moments before supper, he had stood before that very mirror, adjusting his cravat, remarking idly on the dampness in the air. When he came to bed later, he had sipped a cordial prepared lovingly by his wife, then settled beneath the covers. The room was warm with candle glow. The scent of beeswax hung in the air. A perfect setting for rest. But cyanide gave no peace. It arrived like a thief beneath the tongue. His gasp came with startling sharpness, a single, ragged breath that seemed to split the stillness. His hands clutched at the sheets, his spine arched in a brief, silent spasm. Mrs. Redmayne turned toward him, startled by the violent motion, but by the time she reached his side, he had already fallen back, eyes open, chest still, a strange, gentle expression on his face, as though he had been surprised, not by fear, but by recognition. And beside him, the mirror caught it all, his final contortion, his sudden stillness, the faint flush of blue rising beneath his skin. Mrs. Redmayne screamed. Servants rushed up the stairs, carrying lamps that cast wild, flickering shadows across the polished glass. The mirror reflected chaos, now faces distorted by fear, trembling hands clutching blankets, the maid's shaking fingers hovering just above the dead man's cheek. And though no one said it aloud, each person felt the same eerie sensation when entering the room, a sweetness drifting in the air. Almonds, faint and cold. The doctor arrived, performed his examination, and murmured the usual things: heart failure, exhaustion, perhaps a nervous collapse. But the mirror reflected him too, uneasy, rigid, avoiding the dead man's gaze as though afraid the glass might reveal more than he wished to admit. Victorian medicine was not prepared to confront the truth when cyanide was involved. A clean death was convenient, a violent one was scandalous. A poisoned one, especially by a spouse, was unthinkable. So the mirror remained uncovered, capturing every visitor who came to offer condolences. It reflected the widow, pale and trembling in a chair by the hearth. It reflected the doctor, writing his certificate with too much haste. It reflected the undertaker, whose nose twitched upon entering but who said nothing of the almond-scented air. And after the funeral, when Mrs. Redmayne sat alone before the mirror, her black veil trembling with her breath, she saw something she had not expected. Not guilt, not relief, but the faintest hint of vindication. Behind her reflection, the bed where her husband died looked peaceful again. The pillows smoothed, the blankets folded. The house had returned to order, as Victorian homes always did after tragedy. But the mirror remembered. Even polished daily, even dusted with lavender cloths, it held the impression of that night in its depths, the shock, the spasm, the almond-scented air. Mirrors do not speak, but they never forget. And in houses across London, many more would soon bear witness to deaths every bit as sudden, as quiet, and as sweetly perfumed. Servants in Victorian London occupied a peculiar position, present in every intimate corner of a household, yet invisible in all matters that truly counted. They knew the rhythms of their employers' lives better than any physician or confidant. They polished the cups that touched their lips, folded the garments that warmed their skin, overheard their quarrels through thin walls, and carried their secrets as quietly as they carried trays. If poison slipped into a glass or spooned itself into a cup of cocoa, the servants were often the first to sense it. though rarely the ones permitted to speak. In the grand townhouse of the Hemsworth family, it was the lady's maid, Clara Harrow, who noticed something was wrong. She was a thoughtful young woman, observant, steady-handed, and accustomed to reading the moods of her mistress with the skill of someone who had lived too long in the shadow of grief. Mrs. Hemsworth had grown paler in recent months, her smiles brittle, her eyes quick to dart toward the door whenever her husband entered. Clara pretended not to notice, as all servants did, but she kept watch in her quiet way. On a damp evening in early October, Clara carried a tray of tea into the withdrawing room. Mr. Hemsworth sat by the fire, swirling brandy in a cut glass tumbler. His wife was near the window, embroidery abandoned in her lap. Clara's eyes lingered a moment too long on the decanter. It was unusually full. Mrs. Hemsworth never drank brandy. Her husband drank more than enough for them both. When Clara returned later to clear the tray, the glass lay overturned on the carpet, brandy soaking the fibers like a dark stain of regret. Mr. Hemsworth sat slumped in his chair, eyes half-lidded, face disturbingly calm. His wife hovered nearby, wringing her hands in a way Clara had never seen. He collapsed, Mrs. Hemsworth whispered. "Fetch the doctor." Clara obeyed, running into the mist-soaked street to summon help. But even as she ran, a dread lodged itself in her chest. Mr. Hemsworth had not looked ill earlier. His collapse had been too sudden, too quiet, too much like the stories whispered below stairs, when servants congregated in kitchens lit by weary lamps. When the doctor arrived, Clara stood silently in the corner as he examined the body. The room filled with murmurs, the rustle of skirts, the low hum of confusion. But Clara noticed the detail no one else dared mention. A faint scent, sweet, almond-like, hovered in the air, drifting from Mr. Hemsworth's parted lips. She had smelled it only once before, years earlier, when her aunt died under peculiar circumstances in a boarding house near Regent Street. That death, too, had been quiet, swift, almost polite. Cyanide. The word formed in Clara's mind like a drop of ink blooming on paper, but she said nothing. A servant's suspicion held no weight. If she spoke, she might be dismissed, or worse. Victorian law did not care for the testimonies of those who scrubbed floors and stoked fires. The doctor, after a long pause, declared heart failure. Mrs. Hemsworth let out a trembling sob that Clara could not interpret as grief or relief. Perhaps it was both. In that house, emotions often lived double lives. Later that night, while helping her mistress undress, Clara saw a small, trembling smile flit across Mrs. Hemsworth's reflection in the vanity mirror there, then gone. It chilled her more than the evening fog. After the household went to bed, Clara crept quietly to the withdrawing room. The decanter still sat on the table, brandy pooled beneath it. Even from the doorway, she could smell the faint almond note. She touched the glass with the corner of her apron, lifting it gently. A residue clung to the rim, barely visible, crystalline, deadly. Clara's heart pounded. She did not report it. She folded the cloth into her apron pocket and snuffed the lamps one by one. Tomorrow the house would mourn. Black ribbons would appear on the door. Visitors would bring flowers. No one would question the cause of death. But Clara would never again look at her mistress the same way. In a city of polished manners and whispered crimes, servants were the unseen archivists of truth. They saw everything, they remembered everything, and sometimes they were the only ones who knew precisely how a gentleman met his end. London had always lived through its rituals: tea at 4, supper at 8, sherry by the fire, cocoa before bed. Cups clinked across the city from Belgravia to Whitechapel, tiny ceremonies repeated thousands of times a day, all meant to soothe, to warm, to civilize. But as whispers of sudden deaths drifted through drawing rooms and servant halls, something strange and unsettling began to stir. People no longer trusted their own cups. It happened gradually at first, A wife declined her cordial, claiming she felt a touch too warm. A barrister sipped only half his tea, blaming a bitter aftertaste. Hostesses began drinking from the same pot as their guests subtly, pointedly, as if performing a quiet reassurance that all was well. But the fear grew faster than anyone wished to acknowledge. By winter, a hush would fall in any room where a drink was offered. Eyes lingered on glasses longer than they once had. The soft clink of porcelain now sounded faintly like the striking of a warning bell. Mrs. Hargreaves of Chelsea was among the first to speak openly of her suspicion. She arrived at a luncheon hosted by her dearest friend, Mrs. Leslie, wearing a charming hat trimmed with velvet roses, and refused every drink placed before her. When pressed, she leaned in with a conspiratorial whisper. "Did you not hear about poor Mr. Avery? Collapsed over a single sip. Almonds in the air, they say." The ladies at the table stiffened. Fans fluttered. Someone dropped a fork. Almonds. The word had become almost taboo, a coded way of saying poison, scandal, premeditation. A scent so faint, yet so devastating, it could unravel reputations and households alike. No one wanted to believe cyanide was circulating so freely through respectable society. Yet too many collapses had occurred recently. Too many perfectly healthy men and women had died with cups still warm in their hands. By the time a third merchant in Bloomsbury died during his evening tea, people were unable to pretend any longer. Newspapers printed cautious mentions of mysterious afflictions striking the upper classes. Beady-eyed columnists speculated that a new and terrible illness might be sweeping the city, an explanation far more palatable than visible premeditated murder. In the markets, vendors found their trade altered. Tea dealers swore to the purity of their leaves. Confectioners insisted their almond pastes came from reputable sources. Even the costermongers selling roasted chestnuts muttered nervously about customers demanding proof of untainted goods. Suspicion had seeped into commerce the way damp seeped into London brickwork, quietly, persistently, impossible to remove. And in the homes where the fear was strongest, the change was unmistakable. Husbands insisted on pouring their own drinks. Wives requested new tea sets, expensive ones, because the old china suddenly felt dangerous, as if the porcelain itself remembered crimes. Servants were watched more closely, though they were often the least to blame. The wealthy began avoiding late-night suppers altogether, preferring the safety of retiring early. Tea, once the social glue of Victorian life, had become a vessel of anxiety. In one lavish townhouse in Mayfair, a dinner party nearly descended into ruin when a guest refused a cup of coffee with such obvious alarm that the entire table fell silent. The hostess, mortified, tasted the coffee herself with trembling lips. Only then did the guest relent, but the damage was done. Invitations dwindled. Gossip erupted. London society, built on civility and ceremony, was cracking under the strain of mistrust. Yet the most chilling shift happened behind closed doors. Couples who shared a bed now hesitated before sharing a drink. A wife might watch her husband's hand as it poured wine, wondering if only for a heartbeat whether affection had survived the strain of years. A husband might eye his wife's kind smile and wonder what sadness or anger she kept beneath her calm. The city, once ruled by etiquette, was now ruled by unease. Cups no longer symbolized hospitality, they symbolized vulnerability. And somewhere in the quiet, fog-bound streets, those who understood cyanide's power were beginning to realize they held the entire city in their grasp. Every household had become a stage, every drink a question, every swallow a leap of faith. London had learned to fear what it loved most, the soft, sweet comfort of a shared cup. And fear, once stirred, was not easily set aside. In every neighborhood of Victorian London, there existed a woman whose sorrow seemed almost ornamental, polished, refined, displayed with impeccable grace. Mrs. Lydia Farncombe was one such widow. Draped always in the softest black crepe, She moved through society like a fragile wraith of morning, her veil fluttering delicately with each step, her eyes glistening with a grief that never quite dried. London pitied her. London admired her. London whispered about her too. For Lydia had buried 3 husbands. Her first, a barrister of considerable charm, died suddenly on a warm spring evening. A single gasp over a glass of Madeira, then stillness. The second, a retired naval officer, collapsed after breakfast one foggy November. The third, most tragic of all, passed in his sleep, with no sign of illness. Each death was described as unexpected, untimely, deeply unfortunate, and yet, at every funeral, Lydia stood composed and dignified, her handkerchief held lightly to her lips, her sorrow displayed with impeccable restraint. If she grieved too gracefully, no one dared comment. Death followed Lydia the way mist followed the Thames, softly, quietly, enveloping every space she entered. Servants changed their employment rather than remain in her home too long. Florists grew familiar with the exact arrangements she preferred, white lilies with a touch of violet heather. Undertakers bowed to her with a reverence typically reserved for saints. And still, no one questioned the gentle widow, whose husbands seemed to fade like lantern flames. It was during the funeral of her third husband that the whispers sharpened. The Reverend Caldwell, officiating the sombre affair, caught a faint scent drifting from the coffin, a sweetness he recognized instantly. Almonds. He faltered mid-sermon, his voice catching on a word he could not speak. But when he looked up, Lydia stood at the edge of the aisle, her head bowed, her face the perfect portrait of dignified despair. The Reverend said nothing more. Rumors, however, have a way of creeping through the cracks of propriety. Neighbors noticed Lydia's trips to a discreet chemist off Fleet Street, an establishment known for its willingness to dispense potent medicinals to those with money and soft voices. They noted, too, that Lydia rarely dined outside her home and never allowed anyone else to pour drinks at her table. She supervised her own kitchen, her own pantry, her own tea service. Her hands, always delicate in their black lace gloves, hovered constantly near decanters and cups. Only one person dared voice the truth aloud, her young maid, Charlotte, barely 16 and too unseasoned in the art of silence. After witnessing her mistress carefully wash and polish a vial no larger than a thimble, a vial that smelled faintly of bitter almonds, Charlotte trembled with suspicion. She confided her fears to her mother, a laundress who carried the story further. By the end of the month, Lydia's sorrow was no longer merely admired, it was feared. Yet nothing could be proven. Cyanide gave itself to a room only through scent, and even that evaporated quickly. Coroners avoided scandal, doctors avoided implication, husbands avoided thinking too deeply about their own mortality. Meanwhile, Lydia visited her chemist once more. The man behind the counter lowered his eyes as she approached. "The same as before, madam." Her lips curved, not a smile, not quite, more like the ghost of one, drifting across her pale face. "For silver cleaning," she replied softly. He handed her the parcel with trembling fingers. When she stepped back into the fog-damp street, her veil lifted slightly, revealing a face untouched by panic or guilt. Only control. Absolute, unshakable control. London would attend another funeral within the year. Of that, no one doubted. For Lydia, Farncombe moved like a melody of mourning, her footsteps soft as silk, her intentions sealed behind black lace, and wherever she went, death walked just a pace behind, matching her stride with perfect devotion. The dining room of Mr. Edwin Bellamy, senior banker of the Somerset and Crown Trust, was a picture of Victorian prosperity. Gas sconces glowed warmly against walls papered in burgundy damask. Silver candlesticks flickered along the length of a polished mahogany table. Crystal decanters caught and fractured the firelight like jewels. It was a room designed to soothe, to impress, to reassure visitors that Bellamy was a man of stability and impeccable taste. which made the violence of his final moments all the more shocking. His wife, Marian Bellamy, had arranged a modest supper that evening, just the two of them, as Edwin had complained of exhaustion from a particularly taxing month at the bank. A roast pheasant cooled on its platter, untouched. A tureen of soup sat steaming beneath a porcelain lid. A carafe of his favourite claret rested beside his plate, the deep red liquid glimmering like a garnet. Marian poured for him with a soft smile, her hand steady, her posture graceful. No tremor betrayed her thoughts. She had learned long ago that Victorian wives were expected to cultivate serenity even when their hearts boiled beneath the corset stays. Edwin took the glass, raised it to his lips, and sipped. He did not taste the faint, sharp bitterness beneath the wine. Cyanide, properly masked, was rarely detected, especially when dissolved into something rich and full-bodied. And Marian knew his palate well. She had watched him drink, day after day, year after year, complaining about everyone except himself. His tirades at home were infamous among the servants. The slammed doors, the muttered accusations, the ledgers he carried home and pored over with paranoid fervor, convinced someone was cheating him, lying to him, laughing at him. His temper was a storm. Marian lived in its shadow. On this particular night, however, Edwin had been almost gentle. He complimented the table setting. He asked after her sister's health. He even reached out, briefly, to pat Marian's hand. The gesture startled her, not because it was tender, but because it was unfamiliar. He lifted the glass again. Marian watched. Cyanide did not ask permission when it arrived. One breath, perhaps two, then the body rebelled. Edwin's hand tightened around the stem of the glass. His pupils dilated. A strangled noise caught in his throat. His chair scraped sharply against the parquet floor as he lurched forward. Marian rose without haste. Edwin gasped once, a hollow rasp, and collapsed across his plate, shattering it beneath the weight of his fall. Soup splashed across the white tablecloth, forming dark, spreading stains that looked eerily like ink drops blooming in water. The room went utterly still. Only Marian moved. She stepped back, pressing a hand to her mouth in what could have been shock, or something quieter, deeper, long withheld. The faint scent of almonds drifted upward from Edwin's lips, curling through the candle-lit air, like a perfume no chemist would ever dare bottle. The servants rushed in moments later, drawn by the commotion. They found Marian trembling, her voice thin. He simply collapsed. The doctor arrived within the hour. His examination was brief, his diagnosis quicker than propriety demanded. Apoplexy, he announced, his tone practiced. Very sudden, very tragic. He did not mention the almond scent. He did not linger over the claret glass. Victorian physicians were masters of polite omission. The coroner agreed. Heart failure, a man under strain, a banker burdened by accounts and debts and endless responsibility. A tragedy, yes, but a tidy one. Marian wore the mantle of widowhood with exquisite precision. Her veil fell like a waterfall of shadow. Her voice remained soft, her grief impeccably measured. London admired her composure. No one asked about the wine. No one asked why she barely touched her own glass. And as the funeral carriages rolled down the fog-veiled street, Marian stood at her window, fingers resting lightly on the sill, breathing the cold morning air with a steadiness she had not known in years. London mourned the banker. But London never understood the supper. In the cramped, needle-pricked world of London's seamstresses, jealousy did not roar, it simmered, delicate and persistent, like steam rising from a kettle. The women who worked in those dim rooms lived shoulder to shoulder, breath to breath, sharing scraps of gossip as readily as scraps of muslin. They stitched gowns they would never wear, handled silks more costly than anything they could afford, and watched fashionable ladies glide past their shop windows with the ease of beings from another realm entirely. Among these women was Eliza Mott, a quiet, meticulous young seamstress whose hands never faltered, even when her heart did. Eliza was known for her perfect hems, her invisible stitches, her ability to coax beauty from cloth with the devotion of a painter. But her life outside the workshop, unlike her handiwork, lacked symmetry. The trouble began when a new apprentice arrived. Amelia Dawes, bright-voiced, charming, and quick with a compliment. Amelia possessed a softness that clients adored. Within weeks she had secured privileges Eliza had worked years to earn: fittings with wealthy patrons, access to expensive fabrics, afternoons delivering gowns to the finest neighborhoods. And worse, much worse, she had caught the eye of Mr. Silas Penbury, the workshop's proprietor. Silas, though married, was a man whose affections wandered as freely as his hands. For years he had reserved his slyest smiles for Eliza, lingering too long at her work table, complimenting her stitches in tones meant for a lover rather than an employee. Eliza never welcomed him, but the attention had elevated her position. Other seamstresses whispered that she would someday be mistress of the shop. Then Amelia arrived. Her laughter drifted down the hallway like a ribbon. Silas followed it. The change was swift and humiliating. Eliza's assignments diminished, her hours reduced, her wages trimmed subtly under the guise of economic strain. One morning she found Amelia sitting at her own table, touching her things with careless entitlement. Something inside her snapped quietly, like the thread of a too-tight stitch. The idea formed slowly at first, a dark whisper in the lonely rooms she rented above a bakery. She had overheard talk, in the back alley behind the workshop, about cyanide used to clean tarnished silver. A porter mentioned it. A maid confirmed it. And in London, once the word cyanide slipped into one's mind, it tended to stay there. Eliza visited the chemist on Drury Lane under the pretext of needing the compound for silver polishing. Her hands did not tremble as she accepted the small, ribbon-wrapped parcel. She walked home with the vial hidden inside her sewing basket, nestled between pins and spools of thread. The next week, Amelia arrived early to the shop, eager to impress. Eliza watched her from across the room, watched her sip the cocoa. Silas's wife sent up each morning for the seamstresses. Watched the way Amelia laughed as though the world loved her. Watched the way Silas hovered nearby with paternal concern. Eliza waited. And then, one chilly morning, Amelia collapsed at her table, her needle slipping from her fingers, her body slumped forward, cheek pressing into the unfinished bodice she'd been stitching. A gasp, a soft choke, silence. Chaos erupted. Seamstresses screamed. Silas rushed forward. The cocoa cup lay overturned, its contents staining the work table like a bruise. Eliza alone remained perfectly still. The faint scent rose slowly into the air, soft, sweet, unmistakably almond. The doctor declared it sudden illness. A frail constitution, he murmured, shaking his head. These working girls are delicate creatures. No one questioned the verdict. Death came easily to the poor. Amelia was buried in a modest grave. Silas wept. The seamstresses mourned. Eliza returned to her table. Her table. Life resumed its old pattern, silent, dutiful, orderly. She worked longer hours now, with the same precise fingers, the same measured breath. The other seamstresses avoided meeting her eyes. Silas no longer lingered at her side. Yet sometimes, in the lamplight of evening, Eliza would pause mid-stitch. The memory of almonds would drift through her mind, cold, delicate, undeniable. A jealousy resolved, a rival gone. And in London's vast fog-bound web of quiet crimes, her thread had been woven in flawlessly, almost invisibly, exactly like her stitches. In Victorian London, breakfast was a gentler ritual than supper. Evening meals bore the weight of expectation, of manners sharpened like cutlery, of wine poured with subtle scrutiny. But mornings soft, unhurried, wrapped in steam and light, was meant for harmony. A cup of cocoa, warm and sweet, was the closest thing many Londoners had to comfort. It was a child's drink elevated by porcelain cups and silver spoons, a balm before the day's toils began, which is precisely why it became such an effective vessel for murder. On Brook Street, in a handsome townhouse shaded by plane trees, two women shared a breakfast table as stiffly as two duelists pacing their ground. Miss Helena Hargreave and her cousin, Miss Catherine Vale, had lived together for nearly a year, an arrangement forged by convenience rather than affection. They were both young, both unmarried, and both in possession of a beauty that society valued like currency. But while Catherine floated through drawing rooms with a softness that disarmed even the most rigid suitors, Helena possessed a colder, more striking grace, sharp cheekbones, sharper intellect, and ambitions that would never sit comfortably within the narrow corset of Victorian marriage. At first, their coexistence was cordial. Helena admired Catherine's gentle nature. Catherine admired Helena's steadfast spirit. But then came Mr. Jonathan Ainsley, wealthy, charming, and tragically unobservant. He had eyes only for Catherine. Helena, who had expected at least consideration, found herself displaced as easily and quietly as a decorative vase. One moment her prospects gleamed. The next, Catherine's soft laughter filled the corners of every room he entered. And soon, nearly everyone assumed a proposal was imminent. Except Helena. She assumed nothing. She calculated. The jealousy that grew within her was not loud or wild, it was quiet, disciplined, refined. Like everything else she allowed herself to feel. She watched Catherine each morning as she stirred her cocoa with the same silver spoon, adding a touch of sugar, a hint of vanilla. Catherine sipped it with pleasure, her cheeks warming, her eyes brightening as though each swallow fortified her sweetness. Helena knew this habit well. She also knew the chemist on Conduit Street who sold the special compound for vermin, wrapped neatly in parchment, with a ribbon tied like a promise. On a cold morning in early December, frost hugging the window panes, Helena placed the cocoa tray before her cousin, as usual. The porcelain cup steamed gently, fragrant with chocolate and milk. Catherine smiled her soft, trusting smile. "You're so good to me, Helena," she said lightly. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Helena returned, the smile measured, delicate. "Oh, my dear," she replied. "Think nothing of it." Catherine lifted her cup. Helena watched her breathe in the warm steam before taking her first sip. A small one, then another. The swallow was the beginning. It came slowly, almost gracefully. Catherine's eyes widening, her breath hitching, the cup slipping from her trembling fingers and smashing upon the carpet. The rich cocoa bled into the fibers like spilled velvet. Catherine made a sound, half gasp, half cry, before her knees buckled beneath her. Helena rushed to her side with convincing horror, calling for the servants with a voice that cracked at all the right moments. Catherine writhed once, softly, then fell still. When the doctor arrived, he shook his head with solemn gravity. "Heart weakness," he murmured. "So tragic, in one so young." No one questioned the cocoa. No one questioned Helena's tears. Later that afternoon, Helena stood alone in the breakfast room. The morning light had faded, but the scent lingered, the creamy sweetness of cocoa woven through the faint, unmistakable whisper of bitter almonds. She inhaled deeply, then exhaled with a trembling that was not entirely grief. Catherine would be praised in the obituary columns. Jonathan Ainsley would mourn with dramatic devotion. London would sigh over the loss of a gentle soul, and Helena, sharp, ambitious Helena, would once again occupy the stage left vacant. In a city where tea and cocoa soothed the living, Cyanide silenced the rivals. And London, ever polite, pretended not to taste the difference. In the great machinery of Victorian households, polished, hierarchical, eternally turning, the governess was neither servant nor family, neither ornament nor equal. She lived in the narrow realm between visibility and neglect, present in every corridor, yet never truly belonging to any room. Her days were spent drilling French verbs, smoothing quarrels between children, and ensuring the household heirs grew into creatures worthy of society's approval. But when night fell, she returned to a small attic chamber, where loneliness crept in like a draught through the window frame. Miss Eleanor Bryson had lived in that twilight station for 5 years. She was calm, meticulous, and unnervingly self-contained. Her hands slender, graceful, steady as iron, were the sort a Victorian household prized. Hands that never trembled when applying salve to scraped knees. Hands that remained still when parents raised their voices. Hands that could, if necessary, lace a child's boots or administer medicines without hesitation. Those steady hands were the subject of admiration. They were also the subject of eventual dread. The household where Miss Bryson served belonged to Captain and Mrs. Ashcombe of St. John's Wood. The captain, a man of rigid posture and rigid temper, had returned from foreign campaigns with more medals than tenderness. Mrs. Ashcombe, delicate and fluttering, possessed all the refinement of an etched crystal glass and all its fragility. She adored her children in the vague, poetic way of women who disliked their company. Thus, Miss Bryson became the children's true north teacher, nurse, comforter, protector, and sometimes the only quiet presence in a house swollen with tension. It was in this fragile environment that Cyanide slipped its way into the upper floors. The captain's temper had worsened in recent months. His drinking, once discreet, had grown louder, sloppier. He shouted at the servants. He berated his wife for imagined slights. And when the children misbehaved, his punishments were meted out with military precision, cold, swift, humiliating. Miss Bryson watched his cruelty with the same calm expression she wore for everything. But beneath the smooth veneer of her composure, something darkened. For a governess, intervention was forbidden. Obedience was survival. Silence was armor. But her hands remained steady. One night, after a particularly violent outburst that left the youngest child trembling under Miss Bryson's shawl, the governess descended to the kitchen in search of laudanum to soothe the child's terror. It was then she found the jar, small, unassuming, labeled for vermin. She opened it, and the faint almond scent drifted upward like a ghostly sigh. She paused. Then she closed the jar gently, as though sealing a thought. It was 2 days later when the captain's decline began. He returned home from the club, red-faced and impatient, demanding his evening tonic. Miss Bryson fetched it with her usual calm, carrying the tray to the study where he sat hunched before the fire. "Set it there," he snapped. She obeyed. Her fingers did not tremble. Moments after she left the room, a crash echoed through the hallway, a violent, weighty sound that made the servants freeze. Mrs. Ashcombe rushed forward, shrieking her husband's name. Miss Bryson followed at a measured pace. They found the captain collapsed beside his chair, his glass overturned, liquid seeping into the carpet like dark ink. His face bore a look of astonished betrayal, as though death had arrived sooner than he had permitted. The faint sweetness of almonds hovered above him in an invisible, damning cloud. When the doctor arrived, he declared it apoplexy brought on by excessive spirits. The coroner agreed. Mrs. Ashcombe wept fragile tears that dried too quickly. The household mourned with appropriate solemnity. And Miss Bryson? She remained composed, her grief delivered in quiet, impeccable doses. She continued instructing the children, encouraging them gently through their sorrow. Her hands never faltered. Late at night, in the small attic room where no one ever visited, she opened her journal and wrote a single sentence in her neat, unwavering script. Some cruelties deserve a quiet end. In Victorian London, where poison travelled with elegance and death arrived with decorum, a governess's steady hand could be as decisive as any soldier's sword. and no one, not even those who suspected, ever dared question her. To the untrained eye, Mr. Ambrose Whitcomb was the very picture of Victorian respectability. His home on Bedford Square stood tall and immaculate, its brass knocker polished to mirror shine, its windows framed by lace imported from Brussels. Inside, the drawing rooms gleamed with tasteful restraint, walnut sideboards, velvet drapery, and shelves lined with books whose pages bore more dust than fingerprints. Visitors left with the impression of a man disciplined, cultured, and perhaps a touch lonely. But those who knew him better, though few, could claim that honor spoke in hushed tones of his private sanctuary, the cabinet room. There, behind a locked mahogany door, Whitcomb kept his true treasures: strange fossils, antique surgical instruments, fragments of medieval glassware, rare beetles pinned beneath domed glass. He collected peculiarities with the devotion of a monk tending relics. But among the oddities, concealed at the back of a narrow shelf, stood a set of small, exquisite bottles filled with powders and tinctures whose dangers only the learned would recognize. Cyanide was among them. Whitcomb's interest in poisons did not stem from malice, at least, not at first. His fascination grew from a scholar's curiosity, an attraction to the boundary where science wavered into something darker. He read treatises on toxicology with the avidity of a poet devouring verse. He attended public lectures on chemistry, lingering afterward to ask questions too pointed for polite company. He believed knowledge untethered a man from fear, but knowledge can also untether a man from caution. His obsession deepened when he inherited responsibility for his cousin Henry, a gambler and wastrel whose debts seemed to multiply like mold on damp bread. Henry drank, boasted, shirked every obligation, and most inconveniently lived in Whitcomb's home until his debts could be settled. Night after night, Whitcomb listened to Henry's drunken rants echo through the house, disrupting the stillness he cherished so fiercely. Worst of all, Henry discovered the cabinet room. One evening, Whitcomb found him inside, wobbling on unsteady legs, fingering the delicate bottles with reckless curiosity. "Strange little toys you've got here," Henry slurred, lifting a vial of potassium cyanide and squinting at the crystalline powder within. "Wouldn't take much of this to stop a man's misery." Whitcomb's heart tightened, not with fear, but with something colder. He ushered Henry out, locked the door, and paced for hours. A man could lose his collections, his fortune, even his reputation, but what Whitcomb truly feared losing was the singular aura of control his cabinet room gave him. Henry's presence threatened that equilibrium. His existence had become a disorder Whitcomb could no longer organize or ignore. The solution came quietly. On a night when fog curled low across the square, Whitcomb invited Henry to join him in the drawing room for a final attempt at reconciliation. He poured 2 glasses of port, Henry's favorite, and added a pinch of powder to one. Cyanide dissolved with elegant invisibility. It altered nothing in color or scent. Henry drank eagerly. Whitcomb watched. The effects arrived swiftly, a twitch, a gasp, a violent jolt of the limbs before Henry collapsed against the hearthrug. His glass rolled from limp fingers, port seeping into the fibers like spilled ink. A faint almond sweetness lifted into the room, blending uneasily with the fragrance of burning coal. Whitcomb knelt, performing an imitation of concern. When the physician arrived, Whitcomb described a sudden seizure, his voice steady, almost soothing. The doctor sniffed the air, once hesitated, and then dismissed the scent as perfume or spilled cordial. Henry's body was removed before midnight. By morning, Whitcomb's household returned to its customary silence. Only the cabinet room knew the truth. Whitcomb returned to it that night, locking the door behind him. His fingers drifted along the bottles with reverence. The cyanide vial sat precisely where it had before, reduced by only a fraction of a gram. He ran his thumb across its label and felt a strange shiver, not of guilt, but of satisfaction. He had restored order. removed chaos, tidied his world. Outside, London continued its hum of carriages and gaslight, unaware that within one elegant townhouse lived a man who saw poison not as weapon, but as instrument, fine, efficient, almost artistic. And in the genteel quiet of Bedford Square, Ambrose Whitcomb resumed his collecting of curiosities, of relics, of control, and now, perhaps, of secrets. Every trade in Victorian London kept its secrets, but none preserved them as meticulously as the chemists. Their shops, warm with the scent of camphor and rosewater, appeared to be sanctuaries of health. Behind polished counters stood men in crisp waistcoats who dispensed powders for headaches, tinctures for nerves, and syrups for sleepless children. They presented themselves as guardians of the public's well-being. But beneath their civility lay a truth written in quieter ink. Chemists kept ledgers neat, leather-bound volumes filled with names, quantities, and dates. They were meant to record simple business transactions. Yet, in the case of Mr. Frederick Lyle, proprietor of Lyle's pharmaceutical establishment on Holborn, the ledger held something more. A catalogue of whispers the city dared not speak aloud. Lyle was a man of precision. His hair was always parted at the same angle. His spectacles never slid down his nose. His voice never rose above a gentle murmur. Customers found him dependable, calm, clean of conscience. But the ledger he kept locked inside his desk each night told a different story. It was divided into 3 columns: the purchase, the purpose, and the purchaser. But the purposes were nearly always lies. Potassium cyanide silver cleaning, prussic acid vermin control, mercury salts for moth-proofing wool. He wrote the explanations exactly as customers gave them, though he knew most were fictitious. The wealthy rarely cleaned their own silver, and vermin control required far less cyanide than the quantities they sought. Even so, Lyle asked no questions. London prized its illusion of decorum, and he had long ago learned to respect the masks his customers wore. Yet he could not help noticing patterns. The widow on Gray's Inn Road who bought cyanide thrice in a single year, the barrister's wife who purchased a household disinfectant only days before her husband's mysterious collapse, the young seamstress who trembled when she handed over a crumpled scrap requesting prussic acid for metalwork. Lyle recorded them all, his pen moving with steady insistence. Each name carved a delicate trail through the pages. Sometimes he paused, wondering whether he was merely documenting commerce or inadvertently chronicling the city's quietest murders. His suspicions sharpened when Inspector Harrow, a man with grave eyes and a too-tight collar, visited him one drizzly afternoon. "A gentleman has died," the inspector said, voice low. "A sudden collapse, the scent of almonds." Lyle felt the faintest shift beneath his ribs. "Do you keep record of your more potent sales?" "I keep record of everything," Lyle replied. Harrow requested the ledger. Lyle hesitated only for a breath, only long enough to feel its weight pressing against the lock of his desk. That ledger was his livelihood, his reputation, his burden. But he fetched it. The inspector leafed through the pages, his brow furrowing. His eyes lingered on several names. Then, abruptly, he closed the book. "These entries, they'll remain between us," he murmured. Lyle understood at once. The law feared scandal as much as anyone. To prove murder was to open a chasm beneath the foundations of polite society. Husbands, wives, servants, chemists, none were meant to stand at the edge of such accusation. The inspector returned the ledger. Lyle locked it again. But after Harrow left, Lyle did not immediately resume his work. Instead, he sat at his desk, staring into the dimness of his shop. The gaslight flickered gently against rows of jars. Everything appeared ordinary, peaceful, controlled, yet the ledger pulsed in the drawer like a living thing. He knew that if London ever lost its composure, if its delicate veneer ever cracked the names inside, that book would spill into daylight with devastating force. But until then, he remained their keeper, their silent archivist, their accomplice. That night, as he extinguished the lamps and slid the bolt across the door, he caught a faint scent rising from his coat. Almonds. He paused. Then he hung the coat carefully, turned the key in the lock, and walked into the fog. Another man bearing secrets heavy enough to poison the soul, yet neatly folded, stored away, and recorded in a ledger no one wished to read. Victorian London slept uneasily, and Mr. Lyle kept writing. In Victorian London, correspondence was an art ink flowing like whispered confidences, wax seals pressed with trembling fingers, envelopes scented faintly with lavender or violet water. Letters carried love, longing, gossip, and sometimes, though no one admitted it aloud, murder. A single sheet of stationery could change the course of a household. A single sentence could dismantle a reputation, and when the paper smelled of almonds rather than flowers, the consequences grew far darker. The letter that began the trouble arrived at the Haddon residence on a soft, fog-dampened morning. Mrs. Clara Haddon found it atop the silver salver in her front hall, addressed in graceful script, sealed with deep blue wax. She recognized the handwriting at once. Lady Margaret Ashwell, her oldest friend and perhaps the only woman in society who still wrote letters instead of relying solely on visits and gossip-laden luncheons. Clara broke the seal with a smile that faded the instant the scent reached her. Not violets, not rosewater, something sharper, sweeter, eerily familiar. Almonds. Her hand froze mid-air. The scent was faint, barely more than a breath, but it stirred memories she wished had remained buried. Memories of her cousin Samuel's unexplained death, the previous winter, when the doctor whispered something about congestion of the heart, and Clara had smelled something strange, lingering beneath the lavender oil used to cleanse his body. She lowered the letter slowly. Her pulse quickened. Nevertheless, she unfolded the paper, eyes scanning the page. Margaret wrote of trivial matters at first: a recent dinner party, a new dressmaker she recommended, a whispered scandal involving a viscount's daughter. But near the end, the tone shifted. "My dear Clara, if you only knew the truths I have lately discovered. Should anything happen to me, you must remember what I hinted during our last meeting. Beware the company you keep. Not all gentlemen are as virtuous as they appear." Clara's stomach tightened. Margaret had been distraught during their last conversation, her eyes shadowed with worry, her voice wavering even behind her elegant composure. She had hinted vaguely, carefully, about a figure in her household who kept dangerous habits, someone she feared might be involved in matters unfit for polite speech. Clara reread the final line. "Burn this letter." A knock startled her. The maid entered curtsying. "A message, madam. Lady Ashwell's butler has come to speak with you." Clara descended the stairs with dread clawing at her throat. In the vestibule stood the butler, his face pale, his hands tightening over his hat. "Madam," he whispered, voice barely steady. "My lady, Lady Ashwell. She passed early this morning." Passed. Collapsed. Sudden. Clara swayed. The scent of almonds clung not only to the letter, but she now imagined to the very air around her. She forced herself to speak. "Was there illness?" "No, madam, none." She retired early. When the maid went to wake her, he faltered. She was gone. Clara dismissed him with trembling courtesy, then fled back to her drawing-room. The letter still lay open on her escritoire, its scent growing stronger, whether from her imagination or something more sinister, she could not tell. She pressed it to her nose. Almonds. And something else, paper singed faintly, as though exposed to heat. Had Margaret known? Had she been trying to warn Clara? And most chilling of all, had someone scented the paper deliberately, knowing what message it would send? Clara's mind raced. Who in Margaret's circle stood to gain from her death? A husband with debts, a jealous relative, a young maid caught in a scandal, or someone far more practiced in the art of poison? Clara folded the letter carefully, heart pounding. She knew what she must do: hide it, protect it, study it, for contained within its perfumed ink lay the truth Margaret had died for. Outside, the fog thickened against the windows, muffling the sound of carriage wheels. The house felt colder now, as though shadowed by the very person who had ended Margaret's life. Clara placed the letter in a locked drawer. Then she pressed her hand to her heart, steadying herself. For the first time in her life, she understood how a simple paper, creased, scented, seemingly fragile, could hold more peril than any weapon. And somewhere in the city, the murderer who crafted that scented warning walked freely, unaware that their perfumed message had reached the one woman capable of unraveling the truth. The letter remained hidden, but its danger did not sleep. Undertakers in Victorian London were accustomed to sorrow. They handled grief the way butchers handled knives, regularly, steadily, without flinching. Their trade required discretion, gentleness, and a peculiar intimacy with death. But Mr. Silas Corbin, proprietor of Corbin and Sons Funerary Services, possessed something else entirely. He paid attention. While others saw only tragedy, he saw patterns. And London, in those years when cyanide drifted through drawing rooms like an invisible fog, gave him much to notice. Corbin worked from a narrow brick building near Farringdon, its windows perpetually veiled in black crepe. Inside, the air smelled faintly of lilies and varnish. Rows of polished coffins gleamed beneath gas lamps. Mourning wreaths hung like somber halos along the walls. Yet for all the solemnity of his trade, Corbin was a man of meticulous curiosity. It began with a young woman delivered one mist-shrouded morning, her face disturbingly peaceful, her lips tinged faintly blue. The physician's note read sudden heart weakness. Corbin examined her gently, as he always did, preparing her for burial. But as he washed her cold skin, a faint sweetness drifted upward, an aroma he could not place. Almonds, perhaps, or something like them. He dismissed it as perfume, until the second case arrived, and the third, and the sixth. Each had died suddenly, without illness, without injury. Each bore the same faint discoloration at the mouth, and each carried that strange, sweet ghost of a scent, so soft it might have been imagined, yet persistent enough that Corbin began bringing a handkerchief to press discreetly to his nose as he worked. One evening, after preparing the body of a banker who had collapsed over his supper, Corbin's apprentice remarked casually, "Another one smelling of almonds, sir, like the one last week." Corbin froze mid-motion. "You noticed it as well?" "Oh, yes," the boy replied, shrugging. "My mum says almonds are good luck." Corbin closed his eyes. If only that were true. He began keeping careful notes. Not official ones, those would have attracted unwanted attention, but quiet observations tucked into the back pages of his account ledger. Entries written in small, tight script. Young woman, approx. 20. Almond scent faint. Sudden collapse. Gentleman, mid-40s. Same discoloration of lips. Wife, calm, too calm. Child's governess. No history of illness. Almonds, again. By spring, the pattern was undeniable. And yet no one spoke of it. Doctors wrote their diagnoses quickly, avoiding the uncomfortable possibility of poison. Families mourned without questioning. Clergy whispered soothing scripture. But Corbin felt the unease spreading with each new body he washed in cool, lavender-perfumed water. The breaking point came when he received two bodies on the same day, neighbors who had dined at the same table the night before, both dead before sunrise, both smelling unmistakably of bitter almonds. Corbin's hands shook as he washed the second corpse. Poison. There could be no other explanation. But who would believe an undertaker? His profession existed in the margins of society, necessary, yet rarely respected. To accuse the living using the evidence of the dead was an invitation to ruin. Still, he could not remain silent. He visited the local constabulary, hat in hand, ledger tucked beneath his coat. Inspector Harrow, a man already troubled by whispers of cyanide, listened with furrowed brow as Corbin shared his findings. At first, Harrow nodded gravely. Then he asked a chilling question. "Are these deaths connected, Mr. Corbin, or is the pattern you see simply London itself?" Corbin hesitated. How could he explain the quiet epidemic sweeping through parlors, dining rooms, and bedchambers? How could he prove what evaporated from the lungs and lips within minutes? Cyanide left no trace but scent, and scent vanished like breath in winter air. Harrow closed the ledger softly. "These are dangerous suspicions," he warned. "Keep them to yourself unless you wish to invite scandal or prosecution." Corbin left the station with dread sitting heavy in his chest. That night, he returned to his shop. As he extinguished the lamps, he paused beside a coffin prepared for the morning viewing. The air around it held the faintest sweetness, almonds drifting like a last, fading sigh. He whispered into the dimness, "London is killing itself quietly, and we bury the evidence." But the city did not answer. It slept beneath its fog, its gaslights, its secrets, and Silas Corbin, undertaker and unwilling witness, knew he would carry those secrets longer than any mourner. For the dead could not speak, but he could smell the truth. It began imperceptibly, like a mist rolling along the Thames, unnoticed until it had already settled in the city's corners. Londoners, ever polite and devoted to appearances, found themselves pausing mid-tea, glancing uneasily at the delicate porcelain cups they held. A faint rumor had begun to drift through parlors, whispered in the hushed, knowing tones reserved for matters too delicate to state aloud. Almonds, bitter, faint, inescapable. And alongside the rumor came the fear that the city's most elegant tables, its most genteel households, might harbor something far deadlier than debt, scandal, or illness. The newspapers, hesitant at first, printed hints. A social column noted a sudden death among the fashionable set, attributing it to natural causes, while allowing readers to wonder silently. Another, more daringly, described a young woman's collapse during breakfast, her expression serene yet puzzling, the cause unexplained. London's citizens, attuned to the subtleties of social reputation, read between the lines. Their whispered conversations grew longer, their glances sharper, their eyes following one another like cautious predators through ballrooms and drawing rooms. By the time the inquests multiplied, panic had begun to pulse through the city. Housemaids shared tales in kitchens, their words spinning through the air like steam from a kettle. The faint scent of almonds, noticed only by some, was described with increasing clarity, and the connections formed themselves in the minds of those who dared to think. Wealthy women began to insist on preparing their own drinks, even for their husbands. Gentlemen poured their own sherry, holding it as if the liquid might betray their own fragility. Tea ceremonies, once comfortable and predictable, became exercises in suspicion. Among the most nervous were the chemists, whose ledgers now seemed a ledger of dread. They had sold the powders in good faith, or so they claimed, but the buyer's intentions had become impossible to ignore. Many chemists began to demand explanations for unusual purchases. Requests for potassium cyanide, though always couched in polite phrases like "for silver cleaning" or "pest control," were increasingly questioned, sometimes refused. Even the most discreet patrons, widows, gentlewomen, the occasional ambitious governess, felt the heat of scrutiny. And as the fog pressed against the streets, carrying with it the faintest traces of coal smoke and river mist, London realized that a murderer could walk freely among its elegant houses. The undertakers, too, took notice. Silas Corbin, whose ledger had grown heavy with observations, felt a chill not merely of season but of circumstance. He noted the same pattern across boroughs, across social strata. Sudden deaths, gentle deaths, deaths accompanied by the faintest hint of almonds. He began to anticipate calls before they arrived, each one a shadow of the last, each more alarming than the previous. It was not simply death now. It was a sequence, a rhythm, a city's pulse laced with malice. By spring, the panic was unmistakable. Society whispered of invisible killers, of powders measured with scholarly hands and slipped into cups as silently as a sigh. Mothers fretted over the breakfasts of their children. Wives observed husbands with new suspicion. Gentlemen viewed their companions with guarded eyes. Even the clergy, who preferred to speak in terms of providence, could not entirely dismiss the suddenness, the precision, the uncanny consistency of the deaths. And London itself, accustomed to fog, soot, and misfortune, felt its heart quicken. It had survived plague, fire, and cholera, yet this subtle, invisible, scent-bound terror shook the city in ways that illness or accident never could. It was elegant, discreet, terrifying. Cyanide had claimed not only lives, but the city's innocence. The panic, though silent in its beginnings, would soon find its echo in parlors, drawing rooms, and kitchens across the metropolis. London's citizens were learning a lesson the hard way. Even in a society built on propriety and restraint, death could arrive with no announcement, no struggle, no sound, only the faintest whisper of bitter almonds, and the knowledge that it could strike anyone, anywhere. Inspector Edmund Harrow had walked the streets of London for decades, patrolling alleys slick with fog, gaslight flickering like faint stars against the gloom. He knew the city's rhythms, the clip of boots along cobblestones, the distant clatter of carriage wheels, the subtle stench of soot and coal mixed with the occasional sweetness of bakeries opening at dawn. Yet, nothing in his long career had prepared him for what he would discover in the parlour of 14 Belgrave Square one chilly March morning, a scent that made his stomach tighten and his pulse quicken. He had been called, as always, under the polite pretense of sudden death. The household of Mr. Edward Cavendish, banker and widower, insisted their patriarch had merely succumbed to natural causes, but Harrow had long learned that appearances in Victorian London were both polished and perilous. People told what they wished others to hear. The truth often hid in the faintest details. The drawing room was immaculate. Sunlight, filtered through lace curtains, fell upon polished oak and gilded frames. The servants hovered like shadows, eyes downcast. Harrow bent low over the deceased man, examining the pale face, noting the rigid fingers, the stiffened posture. And then he noticed it, the subtle aroma that drifted from the lips, curling through the air with quiet insistence. Almonds. Bitter. Unmistakable. Harrow drew a careful breath and closed his eyes, allowing the scent to linger. Cyanide. He had read the reports, memorized the accounts, traced the rumors, and dismissed none of it. A trained eye might see a heart attack. A trained ear might hear only the rustle of mourning. But Harrow trusted his nose, as he had learned to trust instincts honed over years among criminals and the careless wealthy alike. He lifted the glass that had rested by Cavendish's hand. Nothing about its contents betrayed death, yet the faint almond whisper clung to the rim. The inspector turned slowly to the household staff, noting each expression: politeness, shock, grief, and beneath it all subtle hesitation, almost imperceptible. London's servants were adept at secrecy. They knew when a thing was meant to remain unspoken. "Who prepared his drink this evening?" Harrow asked softly, carefully, as though the wrong emphasis might shatter the fragile calm. The butler stepped forward, voice barely a murmur. I did, sir." His usual claret. "Madam's orders. Nothing unusual, I assure you." Harrow's eyes did not leave him. He had seen such assurances before. Wealthy houses operated like stage plays, with servants performing obedience to the audience of society rather than truth. A man in such a position could lie without the faintest hesitation. He continued his inspection quietly, moving through the room, noting details the household had taken for granted. A faint smudge on the silver tray, the unusual positioning of a decanter, the absence of the sugar bowl that typically accompanied the evening cordial, all subtle signs, all whispers to those trained to hear them. By the time the physician arrived, Harrow had catalogued everything: the body, the objects, the subtle almond aroma lingering like a ghost. He greeted the doctor with a calm nod, refraining from speaking aloud what he already knew. "Heart failure," the doctor murmured, palpating the chest. "Very sudden." Harrow did not contradict him. Not yet. In Victorian London, accusations were dangerous. Proving them was more perilous still. He would wait, observe, collect, like a gardener tending to a thorned rose, knowing when to prune, when to watch, and when to strike. As he left the house, the city fog curling around his coat and hat, he inhaled the damp air. The faintest trace of almonds seemed to cling to the mist itself. London had secrets. Harrow trusted his nose, and he would not let the city's most elegant poison continue its quiet reign unnoticed. For in a metropolis polished by propriety and etiquette, one man's senses could become the first barrier against a shadow that no law could yet contain. Mr. Leonard Grimshaw, apothecary of Cheapside, had kept secrets for longer than most men remembered. Behind his polished counter, amidst rows of tinctures and powders, he presided over a world where knowledge and discretion were interchangeable. A chemist's work was delicate in all senses. One mismeasured grain could heal or kill. A misplaced vial could ruin a household or ruin a man. Grimshaw had sold medicines to ladies, widows, and gentlemen of impeccable taste, and to each he offered the same courteous smile, the same calm assurances. Yet, in the quiet hours of the night, he began to record truths he dared not speak aloud, truths that weighed upon him like the city's fog pressing through cracked window panes. It was a March evening, damp and fog-laden, when the confession began not to another, but to himself. Grimshaw had closed the shop and lingered, polishing the glass jars with careful precision. The faint almond scent that had once seemed merely chemical now clung to his memory like a warning. He recalled every purchase, every polite request, every hand that had left his counter, carrying a powder so delicate it dissolved almost invisibly. Potassium cyanide, prussic acid, a pinch of death hidden beneath politeness and propriety. He thought of the widow on Gray's Inn Road, of the banker at Belgrave Square, of the seamstress and the governess, whose names he had noted in secret ledgers. Each death had seemed at first like coincidence, then pattern, then unmistakable inevitability. Yet he had continued to sell, out of civility, profit, or perhaps an unspoken acknowledgement that manners demanded it. London relied on appearances. Appearances were everything. And so, Mr. Grimshaw, the discreet apothecary, had remained, as ever, unseen in his own complicity. A knock on the door startled him, and the shadows of his small shop stretched like fingers across the floor. It was only a young apprentice, hat in hand, timid and unsure. "Sir, I thought I heard—" "A sound?" the boy stammered. Grimshaw waved him away, but the gesture carried weight. The boy left, leaving Grimshaw alone once more, face pale under the lamp's flicker. He returned to the ledgers. Names, dates, quantities, all meticulously noted. Every transaction, every detail that could one day illuminate a pattern too ghastly to ignore. The apothecary's confession was not spoken, but written, each line a whispered acknowledgement of the lives that had ended too quietly. He thought of Inspector Harrow, who had recently questioned him regarding the mysterious deaths rising in certain neighbourhoods. Harrow had been polite, cautious. as though aware that any misstep could unleash scandal upon the city. Grimshaw had offered answers carefully, revealing nothing more than what propriety required. And yet, in his own mind, he confessed endlessly, to himself, to the faint flicker of gaslight, to the rows of jars that stood like silent witnesses. The confession pressed upon him as he carefully arranged the bottles for the night. He noted the smallest details, how the corks fit, how the powders settled, how the smallest granules could escape unnoticed. Each vial a miniature cathedral of control and danger, and each transaction recorded as a monument to discretion and dread. He paused and inhaled. Almonds or memory of almonds permeated the air. The scent was now inseparable from thought, a spectral reminder of the power contained in his shop. Every night he would breathe it. Every night he would wonder how many lives it had altered, how many deaths it had orchestrated through polite hands and courteous requests. How fragile the boundary between propriety and atrocity truly was. Finally, Grimshaw extinguished the lamps. The shadows lengthened, swallowing the polished shelves. The city outside murmured with the quiet hum of fog and gaslight. He turned the key in the lock and felt the weight of his knowledge settle over him, pressing as heavily as any stone tomb. His confession remained unspoken, hidden behind locked doors and courteous smiles. London slept, unaware that one apothecary carried the memory of the dead in the smallest grains of powder, and the faint, ghostly whisper of bitter almonds in the air. And in that silence, Leonard Grimshaw knew. A confession unvoiced can be as potent and as deadly as the poison itself. Coroner Percival Hartright had long grown accustomed to the peculiar rhythm of Victorian mortality. He had presided over deaths caused by consumption, dropsy, and fever. He had signed his name beneath the verdicts of suicides, accidents, and the occasional violent assault. Yet nothing in his career had prepared him for the quiet epidemic that now clawed through London's most genteel households, a series of deaths so sudden, so unnervingly neat, that even the most experienced inquests struggled to keep pace. It was on a damp March morning, when mist pressed heavily against the windows of his office, that Hartright received the latest case. Lady Beatrice Ellsworth, young, unmarried, and pronounced dead in her bed just hours before. The summons had arrived swiftly, carried by a servant whose face betrayed a mixture of fear and reverence. Hartright dressed quickly, his black coat brushing the floor, his gloves tight and stiff against the chill. The Ellsworth residence was a paragon of Victorian order. The drawing room was arranged with military precision, chairs aligned, carpets brushed, curtains tied neatly to one side. Servants hovered silently, their hands folded, their eyes downcast. Hartright noted every detail as he stepped into the bedroom: the sheen of polished oak, the faint scent of lavender from the bedside water, the velvet curtains that draped like mourning around the windows. And then he noticed it, a faint sweetness in the air, subtle but unmistakable. Almonds, bitter, almost imperceptible, curling through the stillness of the room like a ghostly whisper. Hartright drew a breath, noting the sensation in the back of his throat, the faint tremor it caused in his chest. He had smelled it before, during cases that had initially seemed ordinary, then extraordinary upon reflection. Each time, the aroma preceded discovery, though discovery was slow and never convenient. He examined Lady Ellsworth with the precision that only years of experience could cultivate. Her lips bore a faint blue tinge. Her hands rested unnaturally against the bedclothes. There was no convulsion, no sign of struggle, nothing that bespoke the violence of accident or attack. The only anomaly, as always, was the smell. Bitter almonds, rising gently, curling over the scent of lavender, blending with the faint warmth of a fire that had long since died. Hartright's pen hovered above the inquest ledger. Heart failure, he would write. Sudden collapse. Natural causes. The words tasted bitter in his mouth, yet he knew they were expected. To name poison aloud was to invite scandal. To accuse a member of the gentry of murder was to unsettle the very foundations of propriety. London prized order, appearance, and discretion above all. Yet the ledger itself trembled beneath his fingers, as if aware of the secrets it contained. Hartright recorded the details with meticulous care: date, time, name, location, and a subtle note in the margin, almond scent observed. The notation would go unnoticed by most, invisible to the casual eye. Yet it was a seed of recognition, a pattern, a quiet trail pointing towards something unspeakable. Outside, fog rolled across cobblestones, muffling the clatter of boots and carriage wheels. London continued its daily hum, unaware of the silent epidemic creeping through its homes. Hartright replaced his gloves, adjusted his hat, and stepped back into the mist, carrying with him the knowledge that death had changed its face. No longer loud, no longer dramatic, it had learned to move with discretion, elegance, and a faint, untraceable scent. The city slept, oblivious, while he walked, feeling the weight of lives quietly stolen. Each inquest he signed, each verdict he recorded, was a small concession to civility. Yet in the recesses of his mind, Hartright knew. London had become a city of whispers, of faint almond shadows, and of deaths too perfectly timed to be mere chance. And the truth, though unspoken, was as cold and precise as the glass vials that hid the deadly powder. Small voices are often overlooked in Victorian households. They belong to those whose days are measured in scrubbing floors, polishing silver, and dusting shelves, a life of perpetual motion beneath the gaze of those who matter most. They are present for every whispered argument, every hush of silk on polished parquet, every tremor of candlelight in a dim parlor. And sometimes, though rarely, they notice what no one else dares to acknowledge. Mary Tilbury was one such voice. Barely 16, slight of frame, with hair perpetually escaping the restraints of her simple cap, she had worked for the Wentworths for just over a year. Her mornings began before the household stirred. Water for the bedrooms, coal in the grate, towels folded with the precision of a surgeon's hands. Her evenings ended long after the children were asleep, polishing the silver and tidying the remnants of tea. She knew the rhythms of the Wentworth home as she knew her own heartbeat. It was on an ordinary Thursday morning that Mary first noticed the pattern that had begun to unsettle her. Mrs. Wentworth had been unusually anxious, carrying a small blue vial from the apothecary to the drawing-room, carefully tucked inside her apron. She placed it beside a sugar bowl, then poured tea for her husband as though nothing were amiss. Mr. Wentworth, oblivious in his morning newspaper, sipped the steaming brew and commented on the stock market's fluctuations, unaware that the faintest, sweetest scent, the scent of bitter almonds, had risen from his cup. Mary froze, hand poised mid-sweep of the counter. She had smelled it once before, years earlier, when a lodger at her aunt's boarding house had died suddenly. The memory, delicate and unnerving, pressed itself against her senses. She dared not speak. Servants were rarely heeded in matters of consequence, and she understood that an accusation, even a suggestion, could bring censure, dismissal, or worse. Yet she could not remain silent entirely. That evening, she approached the housekeeper, Mrs. Langley, with the timidity of one stepping across a frozen pond. "Ma'am, I thought I smelled almonds from Mr. Wentworth's tea," she whispered, eyes wide, voice barely above a breath. "It was different, somehow." Mrs. Langley's hand paused mid-polish. Her face, lined with the experience of decades, hardened with the weight of knowing. She said nothing. She only nodded slightly, pressed the cloth against a candlestick, and continued. In Victorian households, propriety often outweighed truth. A small girl's observation was a curiosity at best. Mary could not shake the image of Mr. Wentworth's cup, the quiet elegance with which it had been handled. the precise way the tea had been poured. She thought of the faint aroma curling through the air, invisible yet undeniable. She remembered the patterns she had glimpsed in other homes: a widow's sudden collapse, a governess who fell mid-sip, a seamstress overcome at her work table. They were connected by a thread, subtle yet unbroken, and she had smelled it. That night, she lay awake on the narrow mattress of her attic chamber, listening to the faint rustle of the Wentworth household, imagining the gentle hum of gas lamps, the flicker of candlelight on polished wood. She pictured the small blue vial, resting like a jewel in the parlor, a silent instrument of consequence. Her mind, though young, traced the invisible path from hand to cup, from cup to lips, from lips to cold stillness. Mary understood what the adults refused to see. She saw the faint signatures of death where others saw only manners. She heard the quiet whispers of powder dissolving in liquid, of life slipping away unnoticed. And though she was small, and though her voice might never be heeded, she bore witness. In Victorian London, those who swept floors and carried trays were often invisible. But Mary Tilbury had smelled the truth. And in a city ruled by propriety and silence, that small testimony, though almost unheard, was more potent than any declaration from the drawing rooms above. Victorian London had an obsession with permanence. Portraits captured the countenance of the living, death masks preserved the faces of the departed. Among the wealthiest, wax effigies of loved ones were arranged in cabinets or atop mantels, a delicate and almost magical attempt to arrest time. They were meant to soothe, to impress, to reassure observers that life could linger, even after its breath had gone. But sometimes they bore witness to truths far more unsettling than any painter or sculptor dared capture. Mrs. Agatha Merriweather, a widow of considerable means, commissioned her own wax portrait years before her husband's untimely death. The likeness was flawless, every line of his face captured with uncanny precision, every curl of hair perfectly arranged, his eyes gleaming with the illusion of life. Guests would linger, admiring the artistry, remarking on how the wax seemed almost alive. Yet only Mrs. Merriweather, in her quieter moments, noticed the faint scent that always accompanied it, a sweetness she could not name at first, subtle as a sigh, curling around the polished mahogany frame like a shadow. The scent grew stronger after her husband's demise. It had been sudden, as all tragedies now seemed to be in London. He had collapsed over his evening claret, a faint rasp, his only signal of distress, and was gone before anyone could summon a physician. The coroner pronounced it heart failure. The physician nodded gravely, and the servants whispered their condolences with the propriety Victorian etiquette demanded. Yet in the drawing room, near the wax portrait, a faint aroma lingered, almonds, delicate and unmistakable, as if the effigy itself exhaled the truth of his final moments. Mrs. Merriweather noticed, and it unnerved her. She could not articulate why the scent clung to the air, why it was concentrated near the wax figure, why the effigy seemed to carry a faint, lifelike warmth despite its cold, polished surface. She began to wonder whether the artist had somehow imbued the likeness with more than wax and pigment, whether the sculptor had captured a shadow of the soul, or perhaps a warning. Her fears intensified when she observed subtle irregularities in the portrait. The angle of the eyes seemed to shift slightly when she passed. The curve of the mouth appeared to deepen in expressionless moments. The tilt of the head suggested a secret gesture she could not interpret. At first, she dismissed these thoughts as grief, as the mind's way of searching for reason where there was none. But the scent of almonds, faint and persistent, reminded her of the powder that had claimed him, of the last sip of claret that had turned his life into stillness. The house became a stage of quiet tension. Guests, unaware, admired the wax figure as a masterpiece of artistry. Servants moved about, careful not to disturb the arrangements, and whispered warnings only to themselves. Mrs. Merriweather, however, lingered by the portrait each night, inhaling its subtle fragrance, tracing the lines of its face with trembling fingers, imagining the invisible powder that had altered her life. The wax, for her, had become more than art. It was a record, a sentinel, a silent witness to a crime performed with elegance and discretion. In time, she began recording her observations in a small journal, noting the almond scent, the peculiar angles, the sense that the effigy was watching, remembering. Each entry was deliberate, careful, a way to preserve what society denied her the right to acknowledge. For Victorian England did not wish to admit that death could be so artful, so hidden, so perfumed. And the wax portrait, immovable and silent, bore testament to the subtle horrors that permeated polite society. Thus, in the quiet of her drawing room, surrounded by candles and the faint shimmer of polished mahogany, Mrs. Merriweather learned what few acknowledged openly, that in Victorian London, even inanimate forms could carry memory, could hold secrets, and could whisper, ever so faintly, the scent of bitter almonds that spoke of life taken too gently to see. Dr. Alistair Penworth had been a man of science for more than 25 years, his reputation built on precision, discretion, and an unerring ability to diagnose even the most obscure maladies. He moved through London with the air of authority, his coat crisp, his gloves spotless, his spectacles perched precisely upon the bridge of his nose. Families trusted him, servants revered him, and fellow physicians consulted him with respect. Yet, for all his skill, Penworth had begun to encounter a foe that defied his art, the silent, invisible hand of cyanide. The pattern first emerged months ago, in cases that seemed unconnected at the time. A young widow suddenly collapsed after tea, a banker found cold beside his brandy glass, a governess pale and still in the morning light. Each diagnosis Penworth had made was recorded meticulously. Heart failure, apoplexy, sudden seizure. His conclusions were accepted, unquestioned, as Victorian propriety demanded. But over time, a disturbing familiarity began to surface, and Penworth could no longer ignore it. One fog-laden morning, he arrived at the residence of Sir Reginald Harcourt, a man of considerable standing, summoned under the pretense of urgent illness. The drawing-room, softly illuminated by gaslight, smelled faintly of polished wood, cedar, and the subtle aroma of almonds, though Penworth could not yet name it. Sir Reginald lay slumped in his armchair, face serene, as if merely asleep. His hand rested upon a half-empty cup of claret. The diagnosis was instinctive: heart failure. Penworth's voice, calm and authoritative, reassured the assembled household. The servants murmured in agreement. The family nodded, relieved. Yet, beneath the measured cadences of explanation, Penworth felt a twinge of unease, a whisper of recognition that had begun to haunt his thoughts. Later that day, he visited another household, this time for Lady Penrose, collapsed in her boudoir. The scene repeated itself: pale skin, stillness, a faint, almond-like scent. Again, he concluded, heart failure. Again, the family accepted his judgment. And again, in the quiet corridors between rooms, Penworth felt the growing weight of doubt pressing against the boundaries of his professional certainty. Night after night, he reviewed his cases in the solitude of his study. He traced the faint lines connecting each death, noting the similarities that had initially seemed coincidental. The consistency was unnerving. All were sudden, all were silent, all carried that subtle, almost imperceptible fragrance. And always, the result of his repeated error, the wrong diagnosis, enabled the killer to move freely, undetected. By candlelight, Penworth pored over his medical texts, searching for an explanation, consulting volumes on toxicology and pharmacology. Cyanide appeared in print, described with the detached curiosity of chemistry. Yet its lethality, its speed, and its discretion were almost unimaginable. He realized, with a sinking certainty, that he had been complicit not willingly, not knowingly, but through ignorance and the constraints of polite observation. Every misdiagnosis had permitted another death. The inspector's words from weeks prior returned to him. London's deaths are cleverer than they seem. Watch the small details, the whispers of scent, the inconsistencies no one notices. Penworth had watched, but too often he had been blinded by his own confidence, his assumptions, and the comforting adherence to social proprieties. The city's elegance had masked horror, and he had allowed it to pass as mere coincidence. That night, Penworth resolved to change. He would observe more keenly, smell more carefully, record more meticulously. No death would be brushed off lightly again. London's silent killer would not find safety behind his repeated error. Each patient, each cup, each whispered scent of almonds would now be a clue rather than a mere curiosity. And as he extinguished the lamp, leaving the study in darkness, Penworth understood the chilling reality. In Victorian London, even the most learned physician could be deceived by the elegance of death, and every error had a consequence measured not in ink, but in the stillness of a final breath. On a quiet street in Bloomsbury, behind a polished oak door with brass fittings, stood the residence of Mr. Edwin Carraway, a gentleman whose fascination with chemistry bordered on obsession. The house was ordinary to the casual observer, a narrow frontage, lace curtains, and potted ferns on the windowsill. But behind the door, in a small, dimly lit room, Carraway maintained a collection that even the most meticulous apothecary would envy. A series of blue bottles, each no larger than a thumb, filled with powders and liquids whose dangers were masked by the serenity of their glass. The bottles were arranged with deliberate precision upon a walnut shelf, their labels written in careful copperplate script. Potassium cyanide, prussic acid, and other compounds capable of extinguishing life with the gentlest touch were among them. Carraway called them his curiosities, though the word meant far more than mere fascination. Each was a puzzle he could control, manipulate, and, if necessary, unleash. For Carraway, the allure of cyanide lay not only in its chemistry but in its discretion. Unlike blades, bullets, or poisons with lingering traces, cyanide was silent, invisible, almost courteous in its lethality. A single grain dissolved in claret, a few drops in cocoa, and life could end with elegance, leaving no struggle, no noise, only the faintest trace of almonds as a signature too subtle for the untrained to detect. The first incident occurred during a winter evening, when the street outside was thick with fog and the faint smell of coal smoke. Carraway's sister-in-law, visiting for supper, leaned over the tea service with a smile that concealed suspicion. Carraway had carefully prepared her cup, dissolving a grain of cyanide in the fragrant brew. She sipped it, commenting on the warmth of the room, the pleasant aroma of cinnamon in the air, and then suddenly slumped back into her chair. Her eyes widened, a single gasp barely forming on her lips, before her body went still. Carraway, pale and precise, retrieved a handkerchief to dab at her face, as if this were a matter of etiquette rather than murder. When the servants arrived, summoned by his quiet call, they found the woman serene, her features unchanged by the horror that had unfolded. The doctor was summoned, as protocol demanded, and pronounced sudden heart failure. The truth of the blue bottle, the quiet powder that had rendered life inoperative, remained invisible to all but Carraway himself. Encouraged by the ease of the act, Carraway's fascination grew. Each evening, he would inspect the bottles under the soft glow of gaslight, admiring the way the powders settled like miniature snowdrifts, the liquids shimmering like captured moonlight. He traced his fingers along the glass, imagining their potential. Each was a reminder of his control over life and death, a testament to his intellect and discretion. Yet the very precision that made the collection appealing also ensnared Caraway in unease. He noticed patterns in the city's deaths, the sudden collapses in drawing rooms, the pale faces in bedchambers, the faint almond aroma that lingered like a ghost. He recognized his own handiwork in the subtle chaos of Victorian London, a city that had begun to whisper warnings in the drawing rooms and kitchens of its elite. For all his care, he was part of a larger network of silent murders, an invisible hand shaping the fate of households, unseen and unpunished. As night deepened, Caraway extinguished the lamp, leaving the blue bottles to glimmer faintly in the darkness. The city outside slept, unaware of the quiet epidemic that had begun in parlors and dining rooms. In the small room of blue glass, the powders waited patiently, as did their keeper, whose curiosity had crossed the threshold from study into peril. London had learned to fear silence, and the blue bottles had learned to wait. Winter in London was seldom quiet. The fog slithered along the streets, curling around lampposts, pooling in alleyways, and clinging to the wet cobblestones like a slow, persistent breath. Coal smoke from chimneys mingled with the damp chill, forming a haze that made the city seem suspended between shadow and gaslight. In these months, the living shuffled carefully through their routines, wrapped in layers of wool and secrecy, unaware that death had learned to move with the season, silent and merciless, leaving only a faint trace of almonds as its signature. The bitter cold did not slow the invisible epidemic that had begun to haunt the city. Parlor windows were fogged, curtains drawn against the chill, yet the rooms within grew warmer with the subtle activity of preparation. Tea tables were set with meticulous care, cups and silver polish to a reflective gleam. Gaslight flickered across mahogany, casting elongated shadows that seemed to stretch toward the fireplace, toward the quiet, still bodies that had begun to appear more frequently than any Victorian household cared to admit. In one such home, the residence of the Bancrofts on Tavistock Square, the household had grown accustomed to the season's demands, yet not to its dangers. The matron, Mrs. Lydia Bancroft, arranged the evening cocoa for her children and their governess. Miss Fenwick, her hands steady, her voice calm, but as the cocoa steamed, subtle and fragrant, the faint scent of almonds drifted through the warm room. Miss Fenwick noticed it first, her young eyes widening as she set the tray upon the polished table. The children, oblivious, began their lessons. Mrs. Bancroft poured claret for her husband, his brow furrowed over ledgers and letters. She did not flinch at the aroma, though a small, private shiver ran through her spine. Outside, the winter streets carried a quiet menace. The fog made strangers of familiar neighbors. Sounds were muffled, the clip of boots, the rumble of a carriage, the distant shout of a porter. And within homes, the same silence prevailed. The quiet folding of napkins, the measured conversation, the subtle positioning of decanters and bottles, all seemed ordinary, yet all were shadowed by the knowledge that one misstep, one careless sip, could mean death. Doctors found themselves summoned more frequently. Sudden collapses, fainting spells, and inexplicable deaths multiplied during the colder months. Dr. Penworth, summoned to the residence of a recently widowed Mrs. Chalmers, observed a man slumped in his chair, brandy untouched, except for the portion he had sipped moments before. The faintest fragrance of almonds drifted from his lips, mingling with the scent of coal and polished wood. The diagnosis was heart failure, though Penworth noted the pattern forming in his mind with unease. Sudden death was no longer random. Even the city's undertakers began to feel the pressure. Silas Corbin recorded more cases than usual, noticing the seasonal spike and the similarities that tied them together. The bitter winter brought not only frost and fog, but a strange acceleration of the city's quiet carnage. Each death was swift, almost elegant, leaving behind only faint traces, an overturned cup, a pale face, and a subtle scent that only the trained or the observant could detect. Within these parlor walls, households adjusted their routines in small, careful ways. Tea was poured by the host, Cocoa tasted by the eldest before being offered to the children. Claret sipped sparingly. Servants hovered, eyes alert, hands trembling at the thought of the invisible threat. Parents watched their children with a newfound intensity, their attention heightened by a fear that could not be named aloud. And yet, the city outside marched on as if unaware. The fog hid the gaslight, but it could not hide the consequences of carelessness, nor the spread of death in silence. Bitter winter in London was not merely a season of cold, it was a season of vigilance, of subtle terror, of the almond-scented shadow that moved from home to home, unseen, unstoppable, and elegantly merciless. In the quiet halls of Victorian academia, scholarship was often mistaken for detachment, intellect for detachment from the world's darker currents. Yet within these hallowed walls, illuminated by high windows and the soft glimmer of candlelight, one man had begun to notice a pattern that others dared not acknowledge. Dr. Jonathan Whitford, lecturer in chemistry at a modest but respected college, possessed both the knowledge and the curiosity to recognize what London's elite would rather ignore: that death had found a new instrument, silent and elegant, which left no trace beyond the faintest, ghostly scent of almonds. Whitford had arrived late one evening at the home of a former pupil, Lady Beatrice Marlowe, summoned under the guise of routine consultation. The girl's sudden collapse had alarmed the household. She lay upon the chaise longue, her body unnaturally still, her eyes half-lidded, as though she were merely dreaming. Whitford bent close, and the faint, unmistakable aroma reached him even beneath the perfume of lavender and rosewater that scented the room. Bitter almonds, the whisper of poison. He knew at once: cyanide. The scholar's mind raced, cataloguing the evidence with the same meticulous care he once applied to chemical reactions in his laboratory. A single grain, dissolved in tea or cordial, could extinguish life within moments. No struggle, no sound, only a body collapsed with perfect stillness, leaving behind the faint, sweet signature that few would notice, fewer would understand. Whitford's horror deepened as he reviewed the household's recent events. Similar incidents had occurred across the city, each victim of a sudden, inexplicable demise. The pattern was unmistakable to him, though invisible to physicians who clung to the comfort of heart failure and apoplexy. Each death was deliberate, precise, orchestrated with care, yet shielded by the proprieties of Victorian life. The scholar realized, with chilling clarity, that London itself had become a stage, and the killer, whomever they were, was performing with a craft that rivaled any artist or scientist he had ever studied. Returning to his modest rooms that night, Whitford set about his research with a fevered intensity. He pored over toxicology texts, chemical treatises, and reports of sudden deaths. He noted every detail, every anecdote, every whispered account he could find in the newspapers and journals. The evidence was overwhelming, yet proof remained elusive. Cyanide, he realized, was more than a chemical, it was a master of illusion, its elegance camouflaging its lethality. It left no marks, no trauma, no sound beyond the faint exhalation of almonds, subtle enough to pass unnoticed by all but the most attentive. By candlelight, he wrote feverishly in his journal, giving the phenomenon a name: the silent devil. It moved through London with grace and discretion, striking at tables, teacups, and heartbeats alike. Whitford recorded every incident, every subtle clue, with the precision of a chemist and the horror of a man confronting the unthinkable. He understood that to speak this truth aloud would invite scorn, disbelief, perhaps even danger. Yet in writing it, he preserved it a testament to reason in a city enchanted by appearances. As the hours deepened, the scholar paused, staring at the page, his fingers stained with ink and tremors of unease. The candle flickered against the walls, casting shadows that seemed to dance across the ledger like faint spectres. London slept below him, oblivious to the presence of a subtle, elegant killer whose handiwork Whitford had begun to chart, name, and understand. And as the gaslight gutters flickered low, the scholar knew one truth with absolute certainty. The silent devil would not be stopped by manners, by propriety, or by disbelief. Only vigilance, knowledge, and a courage few in London possessed could confront it. He had named it. Now he had to watch it. The dining room of Lady Isabel Thorne was a chamber of soft gaslight, polished oak, and the subdued elegance befitting a woman of her station. The walls were lined with tapestries whose colours had faded into shades of sober reflection. Candles flickered, casting long, quivering shadows that crept across the silver and crystal arranged upon the table. It was the kind of room where every object whispered of wealth, taste, and a careful attention to appearances. And on this evening, the table was set for a feast that would be remembered not for its culinary delights, but for the quiet, invisible horrors it concealed. Lady Thorne, widow of a prominent merchant, had long been known in society for her immaculate composure and her subtle, piercing wit. She moved through her house with the ease of someone who understood the power of presence, the sway of a gaze, the manipulation of perception. Her guests, gentlemen of standing and ladies of poise, arrived as expected, bowing and curtsying, exchanging pleasantries steeped in charm and tradition. No one suspected that the evening's meal was arranged not merely for sustenance, but for judgment. The courses were served with impeccable timing. Consommé in delicate bowls, pheasant carved with careful precision, side dishes presented with quiet ceremony. Crystal glasses caught the candlelight, scattering it like tiny constellations across the polished floor. But beneath the veneer of refinement lay preparation more sinister. Small, unassuming vials of cyanide, perfectly measured, dissolved invisibly, were hidden in the claret, the cream sauces, even the delicate chocolate confection that concluded the repast. Lady Thorne, ever serene, moved among her guests, ensuring each plate was set according to her exacting standards, each cup poured with grace, each smile delivered with precision. The first effects were almost imperceptible. A slight cough here, a twitch of the hand there, subtle enough to be dismissed as fatigue or the chill that crept through the fogged windows. The aroma of almonds, a ghostly, elusive scent, began to rise softly in the warm air, curling around the edges of the polished room. Lady Thorne's eyes flickered briefly, watching her carefully curated tableau with the satisfaction of an artist surveying a completed canvas. She noted each subtle reaction, each faltering gesture, as the powder moved quietly, elegantly through her unsuspecting guests. By dessert, the full effect was undeniable. Mr. Pemberton, a banker, slumped slightly in his chair, his fork suspended mid-air. Miss Cresswell, delicate and fair, pressed a hand to her chest, eyes wide. The children of a visiting relative, sent upstairs in the belief that their presence was unnecessary, were spared the immediate horror. The servants, trained in the art of discretion, observed from doorways, their expressions tight, their hands poised to assist, yet restrained by fear and protocol. The room's composure remained nearly intact. So refined was the execution that even the most experienced observer might attribute the events to fainting, fatigue, or the cold London air. When Lady Thorne finally allowed herself a moment to breathe, she observed the tableau in satisfaction. Cyanide, subtle and merciless, had performed its work with elegance, leaving no dramatic struggle, no scream, no evidence beyond the faint, bittersweet trace of almonds lingering in the air. The victims lay where they had sat, their faces serene, their lives ended with precision. Later, as the last candle guttered and the fog pressed softly against the windows, Lady Thorne moved to the hearth and placed the emptied vials into a small, locked cabinet. She wiped her hands on a lace handkerchief and smiled faintly, satisfied by the order she had restored. The city outside remained oblivious to her work. London, for all its propriety and poise, had become a theatre in which elegance masked horror. That night she retired to her chambers. Her reflection in the tall mirror composed, untroubled. In the stillness, she felt the quiet power of her deeds, the certainty that control, patience, and discretion could shape life and death alike. The poison had spoken silently, and she had listened with the attentiveness of one accustomed to the subtlest of whispers. In Victorian London, where manners reigned supreme and appearances dictated truth, Lady Thorne's feast was complete. Death had dined politely, and the city would remain blissfully unaware that it had been invited. London, for all its fog and gaslight, had always been a city of dualities. Grand houses lined the wide streets of Mayfair, their windows polished and draped with lace, while alleys and courtyards behind them were damp, shadowed, and alive with secrets. The city's veneer of civility, of propriety, and discretion was meticulously maintained, yet beneath it flowed a current of whispered knowledge, hushed warnings, and unspoken truths. In the bitter winters and rain-soaked summers, these currents carried tales of lives extinguished quietly, elegantly, and often invisibly. It was the housemaids, the young and often overlooked, who first began to speak in hushed tones of these disappearances. They moved unseen, present at every meal, every conversation, every death that passed for misfortune or sudden illness. They whispered of the almond-scented air, the faintest trace that lingered long after the bodies were carried away. They noted which hand had poured the claret, which lady had stirred the cocoa, which gentleman had raised the cup. To them, nothing in the house went unnoticed, and nothing remained unconnected. The newspapers, tentative at first, began to reflect the city's growing unease. Brief notices spoke of sudden and mysterious deaths in polite households. Editors hedged their wording, careful not to imply scandal, but the readers, trained in observation and gossip, understood. The faint almond scent, the sudden collapses, the improbable coincidence of socially prominent deaths, these became part of the language of fear. London was learning that its most polished neighbourhoods, its finest drawing rooms, were not immune to tragedy. Among those who noticed most was Dr. Jonathan Whitford, the chemist-scholar whose lectures had once been confined to the safe, sterile environment of the university. Now, as the epidemic of silence crept through society, he walked the city with notes and observations tucked beneath his coat, recording each case with meticulous care. He traced the deaths, mapped them against social circles, household arrangements, and visits to apothecaries, and saw patterns that others dismissed. Cyanide was not merely a chemical, it had become a tool of influence, a silent agent shaping the lives of the genteel and the ambitious alike. Yet, for all the knowledge, proof remained elusive. Coroners, constrained by social expectation, continued to record heart failure, apoplexy, or fainting without inquiry. Doctors, skilled in medicine but limited by the proprieties of polite society, hesitated to question widows or governesses. Even the police, trained to observe and act, were often confounded by the elegance of the deaths and the invisibility of the evidence. The city had become a stage, and the actors, whether intentional or unwitting, performed with unparalleled subtlety. In small rooms behind closed doors, the perpetrators observed their work with the satisfaction of artisans. They measured powders with exacting care, dissolved them with precision, and placed them within cups or decanters as elegantly as one might set a centerpiece. Death, for them, was no longer a spectacle but an exercise in control, decorum, and discretion. The faint scent of almonds lingered like a signature, a whisper to those perceptive enough to notice, but often lost amidst the perfumes, the fires, and the city's fog. And so London continued, walking through fog-drenched streets, unaware of the invisible web of calculation and lethality that threaded through its grand homes. Gaslight flickered on the pavement, reflecting in puddles that trembled like liquid glass. The bells of distant churches tolled softly, marking the hours as they had for centuries, indifferent to the quiet chaos within polished walls. The city's secrets, bitter and elegant, lingered like smoke in the air. London had learned to smile through fear, to maintain appearances, while the almond scent of death wove through its rooms, its parlors, and its streets. And the quietest voices, the servants, the housemaids, the observant, were the ones who understood most clearly the peril that lay beneath the silk, lace, and veneer of civility. For London, in its brilliance and propriety, had become a stage for a murder without sound, a city whose elegance concealed its most deadly truths. The boarding houses of Victorian London were microcosms of the city itself, bustling, layered with hierarchy, and brimming with secrets. Landladies managed their tenants with an eye for propriety, ensuring that each room was neat, each bed freshly made, and each visitor discreetly observed. The parlors and stairwells echoed with polite conversation, yet behind closed doors, lives intersected, tensions simmered, and in some cases, death moved quietly, unnoticed, until it claimed its victim. Miss Clara Havisham, a young governess with delicate hands and a keen eye for detail, rented a small room on the top floor of Mrs. Penrose's boarding house. The landlady, a widow of respectable bearing, ran her establishment with quiet authority, monitoring meals, guests, and visitors with the diligence of a watchful hawk. Yet no amount of oversight could prevent the subtle incursions of fate or the deliberate workings of a careful hand. It began with Mr. Alden, a tenant on the second floor, a banker of moderate means with a reputation for mild temper and punctual habits. One cold February morning, he was discovered slumped over the breakfast table, a cup of cocoa spilled onto the cloth, his face pale and unmoving. The other tenants stood frozen, unsure whether to scream or flee. Mrs. Penrose arrived, her skirts rustling across the polished floor, her voice measured as she summoned the doctor. When the physician examined him, he found no obvious cause of death, no fever, no pallor beyond the natural waxen shade of sudden stillness. Only the faint, unnameable scent that would later be whispered about in private circles, bitter almonds, ghostly and subtle, curling through the air like a warning. The incident set a pattern. Within the month, a governess collapsed while delivering lessons, a young widow was found resting unnaturally in her room, and a lodger fell quietly during his breakfast, the spoon suspended mid-air, as if time itself had paused to watch. Each time, the scent was present, faint but unmistakable to those sensitive enough to perceive it. To Mrs. Penrose and her vigilant tenants, it seemed as though death had taken up residence among them, invisible, precise, and polite. Clara, who had observed each incident with growing unease, began to note the subtle consistencies, the cups of cocoa, the claret poured for men, the decanters handled with care, and the exact moment when life surrendered. She did not speak openly of her suspicions. Victorian etiquette demanded discretion, particularly for a young woman. Instead, she recorded what she could remember in her small, leather-bound journal, sketching diagrams of table arrangements, noting times, and describing the faint almond scent that lingered after each death. Her careful observations created a map of the silent threat, though she dared not show it to anyone. Other tenants whispered in hushed tones. They noticed the patterns as well, but lacked the vocabulary or courage to name the culprit. Rumors circulated, an illness that moved faster than any known fever, a shadow passing through rooms, or the unseen hand of fate. Mrs. Penrose insisted that there was no cause for alarm, attributing the deaths to coincidence, frailty, or poor constitution. But the tenants knew better. The coincidence was too exact, the frailty too selective. By the end of the month, the boarding house had become a place of quiet tension. Meals were taken with caution. Cups were poured and tasted with suspicion. Glances were exchanged in the hallways, wary and precise. The invisible pattern of death had transformed the very air of the house, turning polite interactions into acts of subtle vigilance. And in her room on the top floor, Clara lay awake each night, listening to the muffled sounds of the house settling, to the faint scratch of quills, to the occasional cough or shuffle from below, all the while imagining the ghostly trail of almonds lingering in the darkness. She understood, with the clarity of someone who had watched too closely, that in Victorian London, even a boarding house could become a stage for calculated death, and that civility and propriety offered no protection against the invisible, meticulous hand that moved silently among them. In the heart of East London, the factories hummed with a rhythm all their own. Smoke curled from chimneys, choking the sky with grey filaments that caught the pale winter sunlight. The floors were littered with scraps of cloth, iron filings, and the dust of daily labour. Women and children moved in practiced lines, their hands stained by dye, soot, and sweat, while men carried heavy tools, their breaths misting in the cold air. It was a city of industry, of relentless progress. Yet one corner of its work, the chemical factory, harboured a subtler, more sinister rhythm that few outside its walls could perceive. Mr. Henry Lockwood, proprietor and chemist, oversaw the production of dyes, powders, and metallic compounds. His workshop smelled of ammonia, turpentine, and faintly of almonds, a combination that some workers attributed to the peculiar ingredients they handled daily. Among these powders was cyanide, required for the extraction of gold and silver in the manufacturing process. To the untrained eye, it was merely another chemical. To the experienced, it was lethal, precise, and merciless. The factory floor was regimented. Workers donned gloves, aprons, and masks, yet the protection was imperfect. The faintest inhalation or contact could leave a lingering effect, subtle enough to escape immediate notice. Several young women had reported dizziness or headaches, which foremen attributed to long hours and poor ventilation. In the shadowed corners, though, some observed more the pale hands, the sudden fainting, the quiet departures from the factory floor with the excuse of rest or illness. Lockwood himself moved with a calm detachment. He knew the risks, understood the lethality of cyanide, and yet treated it as part of routine, much as one might handle sugar or flour. Precision guided every action, measuring, dissolving, sealing. A single misplaced grain could end a life, yet the powder was valued for its invisibility, its speed, and its discretion. Employees learned to respect it, to fear it, but none dared question its presence. The factory, after all, was built upon efficiency, profit, and the unquestioned authority of the proprietor. One morning, a young apprentice, tasked with weighing the cyanide for a new batch of metallic compounds, felt a faint dizziness and stumbled. A fellow worker steadied her, noting the unusual pallor. Lockwood observed quietly from the raised platform, adjusting his spectacles, offering no comment. The apprentice recovered quickly, and the incident was recorded merely as fatigue. Yet the subtle scent of almonds clung to the air, drifting faintly across the rows of workbenches, unnoticed by the bustling, exhausted labourers. Outside the factory, London streets carried their own fog and coal smoke, masking the faint chemical aroma. Inside, the rhythm of production continued uninterrupted. Cyanide moved from vial to solution to vat with the same quiet precision that characterized all of Lockwood's operations. To an observer, it was a factory like any other, efficient, orderly, profitable. To those attuned to the faintest clues, it was a place where death circulated as freely and silently as steam from the boiler. By evening, the workers left, tired, soot-streaked, unaware that they had shared space with a substance that could have ended lives in the most elegant and invisible manner. Lockwood inspected his blue bottles, noting the precise amounts that remained, the powders settling like miniature snowdrifts. In the soft glow of gaslight, he marveled at the duality. Life, sustained by labor, yet shadowed by a chemical so small, so precise, it could end that same life in silence. And as the city slept, oblivious to the invisible threat in its factories, Lockwood extinguished the lamps, leaving behind only the faint, lingering scent of almonds, the silent testimony of a poison that moved unnoticed, routine in its lethality, and perfectly, utterly Victorian in the West End, where narrow streets twisted between high townhouses and elegant shops. Perfumers were artisans and alchemists, blending scents with care, precision, and an almost religious devotion. Their studios smelled of crushed petals, distilled woods, and the faint tang of alcohol, an intoxicating perfume that could entrance, seduce, and delight. Among them, Monsieur Lucien Deschamps had risen to quiet notoriety. His fragrances were delicate, ethereal, impossible to describe with mere words, and much sought after by the ladies and gentlemen of Victorian London. Yet for all his refinement, there was a darkness beneath his artistry, a curiosity that would prove fatal. Monsieur Deschamps had been experimenting, as perfumers do, with subtle compounds meant to evoke emotion, memory, and even obedience. One particular evening, with the winter fog pressing against the street and the gaslights flickering uncertainly, he decided to combine exotic oils with a powder whose properties he had only read of in medical treatises: potassium cyanide. His goal, he claimed, was merely chemical, to study its volatility, its subtle effects on scent, to see if it could enhance a perfume without altering the delicate bouquet. But knowledge in Victorian London was never entirely innocent, and curiosity often carried consequences. The studio smelled of rosewood and bergamot, mingling with the sharp tang of the cyanide powder. Deschamps handled it with gloves and tweezers, every motion measured, every breath cautious. The experiment began with careful dissolution, a few grains into alcohol, a few drops into essential oil. He inhaled cautiously, noting the subtle changes, the bitterness that lingered beneath the sweetness, the faintest, most delicate whisper of almonds that seemed to rise from the mixture. It was intoxicating, almost hypnotic in its quiet perfection. He called for his assistant, a young girl named Amélie, whose task it was to mix, measure, and bottle the emerging fragrance. She approached obediently, her eyes wide in the dim gaslight. Deschamps instructed her to pour a small quantity into a vial, and she obeyed without hesitation, unaware of the lethality concealed within the liquid. The first faint cough from the girl startled him, yet he dismissed it as a reaction to the fumes, leaning closer to inhale the subtle aroma that now pervaded the room. By the next moment, Amélie was on the floor, her small body convulsing briefly, then still. Deschamps knelt beside her, heart pounding, gloves stained, the room now heavy with the unmistakable scent of almonds. He pressed his hands to her chest, listened for breath, and realized with a cold certainty that the experiment had gone beyond study, beyond curiosity. Cyanide, silent and elegant, had claimed its first victim under the guise of scientific exploration. Panic and reason collided within him. He could call for a doctor, but the truth would unravel his artistry, his reputation, the delicate facade of refinement meticulously maintained over decades. The city, always hungry for scandal, would seize upon his misfortune and transform it into gossip, suspicion, and public censure. And yet, to ignore it entirely would betray both morality and law. Deschamps found himself paralyzed between discretion and confession, the faint aroma of almonds rising like a ghost around him. By morning, he had disposed of the evidence, locked the remaining powder away in a small cabinet lined with lead, and instructed his other assistants to leave the studio early. The tragedy would not reach the ears of the wider city. London remained oblivious, mist pressing against windows, fog curling around lamplights, citizens moving through streets unaware of the quiet, deadly elegance contained within one small perfumer's studio. Deschamps cleaned the vials, polished the work tables, and stood in the silence of his studio, listening to the faint tick of a clock. The smell lingered still, almond sweet and insistent, a reminder that knowledge, curiosity, and ambition could be as fatal as the sharpest blade. In Victorian London, where elegance masked danger and propriety cloaked malice, Monsieur Deschamps had learned a bitter truth. Even beauty could kill, silently, exquisitely, and irreversibly. In Victorian society, mourning was an art form, codified with precise rules and punctuated by rigid propriety. Widows dressed in black crepe, veils carefully arranged to conceal expression, gloves drawn taut over pale wrists. Their gestures were restrained, measured, their voices soft and sorrowful. And in the midst of this ritualized grief, some wielded death as skillfully as they wielded etiquette. Among them, Mrs. Eleanor Ravenscroft had mastered the craft entirely. Eleanor had been widowed twice before the age of 30. Her husbands, both men of considerable standing, both healthy and vigorous, had died suddenly, leaving her in black crepe, her expressions polished to perfection, her grief publicly admired. Society whispered with polite fascination, attributing her misfortune to fate or providence. No one suspected the quiet deliberation that had marked the final moments of each man's life, nor the delicate precision with which she had orchestrated their deaths. By candlelight, she prepared the drawing room for her evening tea, a ritual observed by servants and occasionally by acquaintances who had come to admire her fortitude. The china gleamed, the silver shone, and the air was faintly scented with lavender and beeswax. Yet, beneath the veneer of domesticity, lay a carefully measured powder, dissolved invisibly into the claret, the cocoa, or the cordial, depending on the habits of her intended victim. Cyanide, bitter and elegant, moved silently from bottle to cup, invisible to the untrained eye, and deadly in the smallest quantities. That evening, a close friend, Mr. Alistair Fenwick, arrived, summoned by Eleanor under the pretense of discussion over business matters. He settled into the chair beside the fire, unaware of the subtle danger that had been poured into his glass. Eleanor moved about the room with calm composure, offering tea with a measured smile, adjusting the curtains, and observing the flames flicker across the parqueted floor. Every motion was practiced, every expression controlled, each step choreographed to avoid suspicion. Fenwick raised his cup, inhaled the sweet aroma, and sipped. Almost immediately, a faint cough escaped him, his eyes widening slightly in confusion. Eleanor moved closer, her hand extended as though to steady him, her voice laced with concern. "Are you quite well, my dear friend?" Her composure never faltered. The slightest tremor in her fingertips was hidden beneath the elegance of gloves. Within moments, he slumped back, the cup tipping from his fingers, spilling claret across the polished table. The faint almond scent lingered, curling through the air like a ghostly signature. Eleanor's expression shifted only minutely, a flicker caught in the mirror behind the fireplace, unnoticed by any who might have been observing. She knelt beside him, adjusting his posture with careful tenderness, murmuring words of reassurance that carried no hint of their true significance. The servants arrived moments later, summoned by a discreet bell. They found him pale, motionless, and assumed the worst. Sudden heart failure, perhaps a fainting fit. Eleanor nodded solemnly, her black veil concealing her face, her gloves hiding the faint tremor of satisfaction in her hand. Victorian etiquette dictated propriety above all else. No questions were asked, and none needed to be. Later that night, Eleanor sat alone in her drawing room, the flickering candle casting long shadows along the walls. She catalogued the evening in her mind with precision, noting the reactions, the subtle shifts in posture, the faint perfume of almonds that remained suspended in the air. The city outside slept unaware of the elegance and deliberation with which a single woman could manipulate life and death. In Victorian London, mourning was both display and discipline. For Eleanor Ravenscroft, It was also a weapon, quiet, invisible, and absolute. She had perfected the art of death in the guise of grief, and society, ever polite, applauded her sorrow without suspicion. The powder, the cup, the almond scent, all were her accomplices, and together they enacted a lesson London would never see, hidden beneath the folds of crepe and the shadows of candlelight. Behind the high, narrow door of Mr. Ambrose Whitcomb's study, a cabinet stood, its dark oak polished to a lustrous sheen, its shelves lined with glass bottles that caught the flicker of gaslight and fractured it into tiny, spectral constellations. Each bottle was small, delicate, and blue, its contents arranged with the meticulous precision of an alchemist. Powdered compounds, tinctures, and liquids, some innocent, some lethal, rested in perfect order. Among them, the cyanide sat unassuming, a tiny, crystalline testament to quiet power. Whitcomb regarded the cabinet each evening with a scholar's reverence. His hand traced the contours of each bottle, fingers hovering over labels written in fine copperplate. He knew the potential in each vial, the invisible elegance with which life could be extinguished, and the subtlety required to wield it. Cyanide, he had learned, was a gentleman among poisons, discreet, polite, and swift, leaving only the faintest whisper of almonds as evidence. The city outside pressed against the windows with fog and coal smoke, muffling the distant clip of boots and the soft rush of carriage wheels. Inside, Whitcomb moved with deliberate care, selecting a bottle from the back row, its weight reassuring in his palm. The evening had been arranged meticulously. A small dinner party, guests carefully chosen, each seated in positions calculated to maximize effect and minimize suspicion. The powder would dissolve invisibly into the evening's cordial, a single grain sufficient to turn warmth into stillness. As he poured the liquid, he observed the reflections in the polished surface of the cabinet glass. Candlelight shimmered along the curves of the blue bottles, casting ghostly illusions across the walls. Whitcomb noted each subtle shift of shadow, each ripple in the flickering flame, and imagined the delicate transformations that would soon occur across the dining table, flushed cheeks paling, hands trembling imperceptibly, eyes widening in a sudden understanding of their own vulnerability. The guests arrived punctually, greeted with impeccable civility. Whitcomb poured the claret himself, observing the ritual with the practiced attention of one who knew every gesture and word of his companions. The first sip was taken, polite conversation ensued, and all seemed ordinary. Yet beneath the surface, the cyanide moved silently, dissolving in liquid as water might in water, leaving only its faint, spectral aroma to hint at its presence. By dessert, subtle signs appeared: a slight cough, a flush of blue across a gentleman's lips, a delicate tremor of a lady's hand. Whitcomb observed with calm detachment, his gloves concealing any hint of satisfaction or anxiety. The powder had acted with precision, invisible, elegant, complete. The city beyond the study walls remained unaware, muffled in fog and propriety, oblivious to the miniature theatre of death that had just unfolded in a parlor above cobblestones slick with coal dust. After the guests departed, Whitcomb returned to his cabinet. Each bottle rested in place, gleaming softly. The cyanide, reduced slightly in quantity, remained a sentinel of future opportunity. He polished the glass, aligned the labels, and exhaled the faint scent of almonds he had carried inadvertently on his gloves, a reminder of the delicate balance between control and chaos, between observation and action. In the quiet of the study, Whitcomb understood the power he wielded. The city slept, ignorant of the invisible hand shaping life and death, unaware that within one small room, a cabinet of blue bottles held both knowledge and terror. London, for all its elegance and propriety, could not hope to anticipate the subtle currents that moved beneath its polished surfaces. And Whitcomb, ever vigilant, would continue to tend his bottles, silent, discreet, and perfectly, terrifyingly in control. In the candlelit halls of Victorian academia, where dust-laden tomes rested beneath carved oak shelves, Dr. Jonathan Whitford paced with the intensity of a man haunted. His lectures on chemistry had long been respected, yet in recent months, the world of formulas and reactions had revealed a far more sinister application: the invisible, elegant power of cyanide. He had begun to understand, with growing dread, that death could be as silent and precise as any experiment conducted in the stillness of a laboratory, and that it had woven itself into the very fabric of London society. It was the subtle signs, initially dismissed by physicians and coroner alike, that captured his attention. A widow collapsing over her morning tea, a banker slumping mid-sip of claret, a young governess falling while delivering her lessons, each incident bore the unmistakable scent, faint yet persistent, of bitter almonds. Whitford had smelled it himself, lingering delicately in the air like a secret whispered through polished drawing rooms and lamplit corridors. To the untrained, it was unremarkable. To him, it was signature, the unmistakable calling card of a killer both cunning and patient. Whitford's obsession grew, consuming his thoughts day and night. He gathered reports from the newspapers, careful to note the timing, the location, and the social rank of each victim. Letters from concerned relatives arrived at his chambers, describing sudden collapses with unsettling consistency. Even the subtle reaction of servants, those silent observers of households, became data points in a larger pattern. Each grain of information added to the map he was constructing, a lattice of evidence invisible to the polite society that prided itself on order and appearance. In his journal he wrote with meticulous care, his quill scratching softly across the pages, cataloguing the deaths with precision. He gave the phenomenon a name: the Silent Devil. It moved unseen through London's households, polite, discreet, imperceptible, yet leaving a faint trace for those perceptive enough to notice. A single grain, dissolved in cocoa or claret, could extinguish life without struggle, leaving only the ghostly signature of almonds in its wake. The city had become its stage, and the killer its unseen conductor. Whitford understood the social impossibility of speaking openly. To accuse a widow, a governess, a housemaid, or a gentleman of murder in polite society was to invite scandal, disbelief, and ruin. Yet, he also recognized the moral imperative. Knowledge of the pattern demanded vigilance. He spent hours visiting households under the guise of lectures or consultation, inhaling the air, noting the positions of decanters, the arrangement of cups, the subtlest movements of hands and expressions. Every detail was evidence, every observation a shield against further deaths. As he wrote late into the night, the gaslight flickering against the walls of his study, Whitford realized that naming the phenomenon was only the beginning. The Silent Devil would continue its work unless confronted with awareness and cunning. It required no malice beyond precision, no motive beyond calculation. The city, for all its refinement, remained vulnerable, blind to the invisible hand moving through its drawing rooms and parlors. Whitford leaned back, exhausted yet alert. Outside, London slept beneath fog and gaslight, oblivious to the delicate network of deaths that threaded silently through its streets. Inside, he resolved to continue his vigilance, to track the subtle signs, to follow the faint scent wherever it might lead. Knowledge, he understood, was the only weapon capable of confronting the elegance and lethality of the Silent Devil. And in that quiet chamber, surrounded by the weight of books and candlelight, the scholar named the invisible horror, charted its patterns, and prepared to face the shadow that London itself refused to acknowledge. Victorian London prided itself on civility, decorum, and the measured enforcement of law. Magistrates in powdered wigs sat in solemn courtrooms, their gavel strikes echoing like whispers of authority. Policemen patrolled the streets with stiff collars and heavy boots, trained to observe, record, and intervene. And yet, When it came to the invisible epidemic that had crept through parlors, dining rooms, and boarding houses, the law was always a step behind. The earliest cases had been dismissed politely as accidents or natural causes. Heart failure, apoplexy, fainting, these diagnoses were convenient and socially acceptable. A widow's sudden collapse, a governor stricken mid-lesson, a banker slumped over his claret, no one questioned, no one investigated beyond the perfunctory call to a physician or coroner. London's obsession with propriety insulated the guilty and silenced the observant. And as the months passed, the pattern became undeniable to those few willing to notice, yet impossible to prosecute without scandal. By the time the courts began to convene, public anxiety had swelled. Whispers filled drawing rooms, servants exchanged furtive glances, and the faint, ghostly scent of bitter almonds was understood, if rarely named aloud, by those who could recognize it. The law, slow and meticulous, finally took note. Magistrates instructed coroners to record sudden deaths with greater scrutiny. Police were ordered to observe households more diligently, and apothecaries were cautioned regarding the sale of certain compounds. Yet even these measures arrived belatedly, after countless lives had been quietly extinguished. One case, in particular, exemplified the futility of law catching up to subtle crime. Lady Beatrice Ellsworth had been found collapsed in her boudoir, a fine silk scarf clutched to her chest. Her death had been swift and silent, the faint aroma of almonds lingering in the air, a signature invisible to those untrained in its recognition. Dr. Penworth, summoned post-haste, recorded heart failure. Coroner Hartright signed the certificate. The city mourned politely, oblivious to the invisible hand that had claimed her life. By the time investigators pieced together the subtle inconsistencies, the precise handling of decanters, the timing of visits, the faint traces of cyanide in overlooked vessels, the perpetrator had vanished into the anonymity of London society. Efforts to regulate the sale of cyanide and other lethal powders were similarly slow. Apologists argued for commerce, for science, for convenience, while deaths continued, quiet and unremarkable to the casual observer. The law, bound by precedent and constrained by social expectation, could only react, never anticipate. Each directive was a step forward, yet always lagging behind the meticulous orchestration of those who wielded poison with the discretion of artists and the patience of scholars. In courtrooms, debates were polite, forensic in their terminology, yet abstract, disconnected from the visceral reality of the victims. Magistrates pondered liability, intent, and negligence, unaware that in London, death had already acted with elegance and swiftness. Families pressed for closure, their grief tempered by propriety, while the true danger, the subtle, silent, almond-scented hand of murder remained largely untouched by statute or investigation. By the candlelight of his chambers, Dr. Whitford read accounts of the latest trials with mounting frustration. Knowledge, meticulous observation, and pattern recognition were ignored in favor of polite assumptions. Cyanide, invisible and precise, had outpaced the instruments of justice. London's law, with all its formalities and solemnity, had arrived too late, and countless lives had been consumed in the silence between judgment and recognition. Outside, fog pressed against the gaslight, muffling carriage wheels, echoing footsteps, and the faint creak of doors. Inside, the courts deliberated, oblivious to the elegance of a crime that had moved faster than the law itself, leaving London to mourn, question, and remain forever unaware of the subtle horror threading through its refined and gaslit streets. In Victorian London, sweetness had always been a symbol of comfort and civility. Cocoa and tea soothed the nerves, honey sweetened bread and preserves. Confectioners' shops filled the streets with the gentle perfume of sugar and candied fruit. Children were placated by it, wives by it, and even the most austere gentleman allowed a fondness for its delicate pleasure. Yet in the wintered and gaslit parlors of the city, sweetness had begun to carry a new meaning, one far more sinister than any confectioner had intended. It began with caution. Almost imperceptibly, ladies began to stir their cocoa themselves, adding the sugar with trembling fingers, tasting first before offering it to guests. Gentlemen poured their own claret, their eyes flicking toward the cups of their neighbors as if measuring intent and vigilance. Servants hovered closer, noticing every subtle motion, every careless tilt of a teacup, every faint glimmer of a powder that might be hiding in plain sight. The almond scent, faint, elusive, lingering, had taught the city that sweetness could kill. Mrs. Hargreave, a widow of considerable elegance and taste, was among the first to articulate the fear that had begun to suffuse polite society. She instructed her maids to pour no drink for any visitor without her direct observation. Sugar bowls were locked away. Cocoa was stirred only under supervision. Claret and brandy were served in decanters polished to reflective perfection. Every precaution seemed insufficient, yet the rituals themselves offered a measure of control. London's citizens, for the first time, understood that the invisible hand of poison could move through velvet gloves, polite smiles, and carefully measured spoons. The fear spread like fog. Luncheon tables became arenas of subtle scrutiny, breakfasts laden with suspicion. Guests lifted their cups with caution, testing aroma, color, and weight before sipping. Conversations, once light and gentle, carried the undercurrent of tension. Small glances across the table could mean accusation or alarm. London, a city proud of its etiquette, had learned that manners were no shield against a quiet, lethal intent. Even the upper echelons of society were not immune. At a gathering in Mayfair, a widow refused the cocoa offered by her neighbor, claiming a delicate stomach, yet her sharp eyes tracked every hand and vessel. A banker's wife insisted on pouring her husband's wine herself, measuring each drop as though the liquid contained a truth he must not unknowingly consume. Housemaids whispered to one another in kitchens, noting patterns that remained invisible to the eyes above stairs. Cyanide, previously a curiosity of chemistry, had become an agent of terror, its presence marked only by the faintest perfume, the ghost of almonds in the air. Dr. Whitford, who had meticulously catalogued incidents, observed the city's transformation with grim satisfaction. His warnings, once dismissed as paranoid musings, were now visible in the behavioral shifts of households, the meticulous precautions, and the pervasive unease. Sweetness, once a comfort, had become suspect. Londoners now regarded the preparation and consumption of beverages with suspicion, their rituals altered by fear of the invisible and precise hand of death. In parlors, drawing rooms, and boarding houses, the lesson became clear. Nothing sweet was safe, nothing routine beyond scrutiny. Candles flickered over polished silver, tea was stirred with measured care, claret was poured under the watchful eye of its recipient. Politeness remained, but suspicion had claimed its shadow. Victorian London had learned to fear sweetness, to measure trust with every sip, to question every gesture. The almond scent lingered in every corner, a ghostly reminder that even elegance could conceal lethal intent. And so, the city, wrapped in fog and propriety, gaslight and silence, adapted. Mirth and civility persisted in appearance, yet beneath the polish and etiquette, London had learned an enduring lesson. Sweetness could no longer be trusted, for it had become the vehicle of invisible death, elegant, silent, and merciless. The last chapter of London's delicate reckoning with cyanide did not arrive with fanfare or proclamation. It came quietly, as all things of consequence did, in a city governed by propriety and gaslight, where whispers travelled faster than carriage wheels, and secrets thrived behind drawn curtains. Victorian society, obsessed with appearances, had finally absorbed the lesson written in almond-scented air. Sweetness, once a balm, could harbour death. It began in the small moments. Gentlemen lifted their claret with scrutiny, measuring the warmth, the aroma, the weight of the glass as though each sip were a challenge. Ladies stirred cocoa with careful observation, tasting before offering to their companions. Housemaids, young and otherwise invisible, lingered by tables and decanters, noting the faintest tremor of a hand or the shadow of a glimmer of powder. The city had learned that life's most benign rituals, tea, coffee, cocoa, could conceal a precise, lethal elegance. The phenomenon was subtle, yet persistent. A widow in Mayfair refused her usual morning cordial, insisting she preferred water, though the reasoning was thin and polite. A banker's wife poured wine for her husband personally, as though she alone could safeguard his well-being from invisible malice. Children's drinks were tested by governesses before consumption, each sip a trial against potential danger. Candles flickered across polished surfaces, reflecting the gaslight in miniature constellations, while the faint aroma of almonds, bitter, delicate, insistent, hovered like a ghost in the air, a reminder of peril few dared to name. Doctors, initially unaware, began to recognize the pattern. Dr. Penworth noted the suddenness of deaths, their calm precision, and the subtle signs left behind. Lips tinged faintly blue, cups tipped slightly, the presence of almond-scented traces that eluded casual notice. Coroners such as Hartright observed with mounting unease that sudden heart failures were disproportionately frequent in households where decanters, cordial glasses, and domestic powders were handled with exacting care. Even the police, previously hampered by propriety and social expectation, began to track the incidents, though formal charges remained elusive. London's law, finally aware, still struggled to catch the invisible hand that orchestrated these deaths with elegance. The city's social rituals changed in response. Luncheons, previously leisurely, became exercises in vigilance. Breakfasts were cautious affairs, where each cup was observed, each pour measured, each guest watched for subtle shifts. Conversations carried undertones of suspicion, polite and coded. Houses with blue bottles, decanters, and delicate powders became epicenters of quiet anxiety, their inhabitants aware, consciously or unconsciously, that death could enter with elegance and discretion. Guests learned to sip cautiously, to smile with care, to trust appearances only so far. And yet the city did not collapse under fear. Victorian society, as always, maintained its veneer. Gaslight flickered along fog-laden streets, coaches rolled along cobbled roads. The Thames carried its mist, indifferent to the events above. Candles glimmered in parlors, reflecting on polished wood and silver. The almond scent lingered faintly in the mind of those perceptive enough to notice, a ghostly echo of caution, a silent teacher reminding all that elegance and death were not mutually exclusive. In this era, London had learned a profound truth, that propriety, refinement, and sweetness could no longer be trusted. Even the gentlest cup might conceal the final exhalation of life. Every sip became an act of vigilance, every ritual of civility shadowed by awareness. Cyanide, invisible and meticulous, had reshaped society's understanding of danger, turning domesticity into a stage for caution, suspicion, and the elegant, silent hand of death. Victorian London would never again sip its cocoa, pour its claret, or taste its sweetness with the same innocence. The city had been forever transformed. Elegance, civility, and almond-scented danger had become inseparable. And in that quiet, gaslit awareness, London's people finally understood that death could move with the most exquisite decorum, and that no sweetness, however delicate, could ever be trusted again.